Welcome, everyone, to the edition of Noisy Reality, our lectures on the campaigns of 1942. Especially, we're focusing in on the whole question of the Second Front and whether it was feasible or not to be launched in 1942. 1942 is a fascinating year to look at and filled with all sorts of questions and contradictions. And we're going to be joined today with Gary Giumarra, who will be introduced by Alex Stavropoulos. Noisy Reality will be handling all sorts of different topics, not only military history, but politics and culture as we evolve. But let me turn it over to my colleague, Alex Stavropoulos.
I'm Alex Stavropoulos, and our speaker today is Gary Giumarra. He's a computer software developer coming to us from Los Angeles. He's a graduate of UC Berkeley and has, a master's in military history from the American Military University. So I'll just turn it over to Gary to do his presentation. So Gary, go.
Great, thank you. All right, well, I'm grateful to Jim and Noisy Reality and to all of you for being here and for the opportunity to address you all today on the findings of my research and analysis of, I guess, over 15 years now. I haven't done too many presentations recently, so I did one about a year ago, and I totally mismanaged my time, so not leaving myself enough at the end. So I'm going to kind of launch right into things. As Jim set it up, we are top front, principally 1942, but I'm going to cast a bit of a wider net and basically look, time points along the way between 1942, the time that Operation Neptune /Overlord was launched in June of 1944. Okay. So, on August 2nd, 1942, Adolf Hitler held the first of 3 meetings with top subordinates, including the commander of his army in the West, OB West, Field Marshal Gerhard von Rundstedt, regarding the invasion threat in Western Europe. Hitler raided current coastline defenses there, which consisted largely of poorly armed groups of 30 to 70 men in open trenches as, quote, weak and insufficient, unquote. Since he could only spare, quote, negligible forces, unquote, from the decisive campaign in the East, the coastline lacked at least 8 to 12 divisions needed for a continuous defense. He estimated that in the 2 to 3 days it would take to get reserves to a landing area, the enemy could put ashore up to 300,000 men and do so at multiple sites. Difficult to distinguish between feints and the true main invasion. He recognized the Allies would exercise complete air superiority and wield prodigious naval firepower. He wondered too what troubles the French might make in his rear following. At the last of these conferences on September 29th, Hitler warned against false optimism based on the recent Allied failure at He summed up by saying, only invasion in the West, by forcing him to forces he needed to keep concentrated in the East, which again, he considered the decisive theater, could prevent German victory. And that's underscoring his sobering opening remarks. Though he had never capitulated in the past, Hitler said, he now must openly admit that a second front in Europe would bring to an absolutely critical situation. Now, Hitler would have been relieved to know that the Western Allies had already, by the end of July, decided against opening a second front in Northwest Europe, pursuant to some rather contentious talks between top military brass, American and British, in London towards the mid to end of July. And they had actually agreed to a strategy document that held that such an undertaking, due to the now new commitment to invade French Northwest Africa, was essentially impossible the next year as well. So the near unanimous opinion of post-war historians who have commented on the matter is that the idea that there could have been a successful second front in Northwest Europe before the one that did occur was not just dubious but positively absurd. And here I have kind of a representation of a few different historians that have commented, emphatically on it. This is by no means an exhaustive list. I have to say that these comments that I mention here, or that I list here, relate primarily to Sledgehammer. So a 1942 attempt at a cross-channel invasion, but we're going to touch upon some other ones as well. But I mean, once you're to the fact of a commentary on early Second Front, the list just could go on and on with different historians who have commented on it and basically held that it was impossible. And in fact, in their attempt to demonstrate the impossibility of an event that never took place, many historians have put forward a number of propositions that rely, what I feel, on shaky evidence, or really not at all. They just assert it as if it's it's a postulate that everyone agrees to automatically. But and it has become somewhat more or less foundational to our understanding of World War II. Many of them form the basis for their own counterfactual conclusion that if the Western Allies had attempted to open a second front in Europe much before June of 1944, it would have been a failure. For that reason alone, I feel a deeper examination is warranted. Okay, so today we're not really going to. It may sound like we're going to go down numerous counterfactual rabbit holes, and we will a little bit gingerly here and there. But since Jim has given me 2 weeks to talk about this, I'm going to try to put most of that off to next week, the next presentation, which actually I hope is more factual than counterfactual itself, but there'll be counterfactual speculation. And of course, in Q&A, anything you guys want to ask me about, we'll deal with. But I'm going to basically limit my presentation to here to factual and some analysis. So I really feel what I'm going to concentrate on is mostly dealing with the resources and capabilities of both sides at various points of the war as it relates to a second front or a cross-channel attack. It illuminates opportunities for the Allies at each of those points. Okay, so beyond the merely factual presentation I'm making today, which I hope is interesting you, regardless if you accept any of my analysis, I'm just going to put forth a hypothesis that the accepted historical narrative that has it back wasn't the poor performance in the middle years of the war that validated the default gradualist / go slow strategy characterization the Western Allies pursued until 1944. It was that strategy that was the principal cause of the poor performance, and that also substantially delayed victories in the areas of the war that putatively had yet to be quote unquote won and were prerequisite to final victory, principally because it widely dispersed Allied resources across the globe. Okay, so I also just want to mention that since the decisions of Anglo-American leaders is the variable we're examining here, I'm going to try as much as possible to avoid discussions that relate to their own personalities or prejudices. If someone wants to say that Churchill would have never ever agreed to this or that, I might actually agree with you, but I just want to set that aside for the time being. Okay. So I guess the last thing I want to say is we're really going to spend a lot of time looking at this from the Germans' perspective. I think that's the part that has really been neglected, and to the extent that it's not really well informed in the historical literature. All right, so what was Germany's strategic situation coming into 1942? Obviously, they had massive losses in men and materiel in the previous year's campaign. And that caused manpower shortages. There was a competition between the labor force, that back in Germany, creating the armaments, and the Wehrmacht, the armed forces. In fact, they'd actually borrowed hundreds of thousands of men to launch the campaign, the Barbarossa campaign, borrowed them from German industry with the idea they'd be back in a few months. Well, of course, they weren't coming back. So, just 1 second here. Okay. So there's that competition. And here's a really important thing to understand. I think the idea is that since Germany had mobilized so much earlier than everyone else and had such a head start and was such a militarized country, that they completely mobilized their economy for war, but they hadn't by the time they invaded the Soviet Union. And in fact, they'd already started to convert over before the campaign was over. Hitler, anticipating, that victory was coming soon, had already given orders to convert the armaments production back over to air and naval, and to de-emphasize Army ground-based armaments. And which they'd also, for instance, in the area of ammunition, they'd had a fairly good stockpile from. So there was also shortages of critical natural resources, above all oil. I think a lot of you are familiar with the Hitler saying at the beginning of the campaign in the summer of 1942, Blau, that if Germany did not get at least the oil fields of Grozny and Maikop, that he might have to end the war, which was kind of a surprise to many of his interlocutors at the time. There were no army reserves in Germany by the late summer of 1942. There's no reserves in Germany, and practically none on the Eastern Front. And it just show the story. You have poorly equipped and motivated allies manning hundreds of miles on the Eastern Front, which, as any of you know, the Stalingrad campaign will know that really came back to bite them. So, in short, Germany was stretched to the breaking point. And I think that's another thing. I recently was listening to or watched a YouTube video, which was actually a very good one, but the historian there was mentioning 1942 as like peak Germany. So I kind of worked that into this presentation. It is peak Germany in terms of our expansion, but you can look at that both different ways. Peak expansion doesn't necessarily mean winning. It can mean that you're vulnerable as well if you're overextended, which I maintain Germany was. Okay, so let's just look at one really important aspect: the number of divisions. Okay, there's kind of this general idea out there. The whole idea of peak Germany is obviously 1940 is the peak. Later on, there's lots of losses and men and materiel. There's casualties and that sort of thing. So I'm just comparing here. How many divisions did the German army have between 1942, comparing mid 42 and mid 44? You can see it was actually greater. Okay, so division is not a division. We know that. But if you actually look at the number of men in each division in May of 1944, it's greater than in 43, the same point in May of 43 or May of 42. They're also closer to their authorized strength on average. So just one data point. specifically, let's compare divisional strength in the West. Okay, as you know, I mentioned before that Hitler had maintained that the decisive theater was going to be in the East. Okay, well, that's going to undergo a change towards the end of 1943. He issues Hitler Directive number 51. It specifically states that we are now changing our emphasis from the East, and now the new decisive theater will be in the West, because he anticipates that invasion's coming, and he feels that that's the key to victory is to defeat that invasion. So here you see the number of Panzer divisions is up. It does have two. It doesn't have any motorized divisions per se. Infantry divisions is more, what you would call first class divisions, quite a bit more, and the total number of divisions are more. Okay, so I'm excluding here, which a lot of historians fail to do, training, so-called reserve divisions, security or Luftwaffe field divisions, because the German army themselves didn't really consider those as real field units. Although in 1944, some of the security units had been upgraded somewhat. They've been getting some extra equipment. So you might even have bumped up the 49 there to something over 50 if you wanted to count those. But they didn't in Normandy, as far as I know. So I think this is a good summation. All right, so let's just look at the number of combat divisions in France and Belgium in early October of 1942. And I'm gonna, so I'm not gonna get into too much details on Sledgehammer. This, we're gonna touch on it here and there, because we have next week to deal with that. But basically, if the meetings in July had gone the other way, Americans who were advocating, won the debate. And based upon the parameters of the then current plan, which called for an invasion of the Cotentin Peninsula, conveniently enough. Before there had been discussion of Calais. It's kind of gone back and forth, but now they decided definitively on Cherbourg. But anyway, if that had gone forward, the first period would come after the 10-week and called for that fell within the right parameters in terms of
Gary,
ties.
just a question. You have dates on some of the units, so just tell everybody what that means.
Okay, I will. So anyway, but just let me finish. So it would have gone forward around the beginning of October, around October the 5th. That's when it would have probably gone down. So that's why I chose early October. Okay, so you notice in the comments where in the brackets, the square brackets where it has the month. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
And some have actual in parentheses dates, like 10 to 22, 42.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So the square brackets are the month that division departed for the Eastern Front or someplace. I think it's 10th. No, I don't. If they're in square brackets, it's the Eastern Front. And of course, if it's January or February, that means 1943. So this is all late 1942, early 1943. Okay. So it just gives you an idea of how they were using these. And I'll have a slide later on that kind of goes into that. The other ones are where I give the fighting strength. So for instance, let's look at the kind of towards the lower right hand and the right hand columns. You have the 10th Panzer. It shows their Gefechtsstärke was 8,610 on 10/22 of 42. Okay, October 22nd of 42. And the first SS, which was a motorized division then, it was not a Panzer division, it was not Panzer Grenadier. It showed 11,414. So these are just kind of some representative numbers. I didn't try to put, I don't have the numbers for all these divisions. But the only one I have up there, I think, is the second SS, the Das Reich, 10,500. Now, both those SS divisions are going to get the order in mid-November to convert to Panzer Grenadier divisions, at which point they get more equipment, they get more tanks, they get more personnel, and they get more training time before they leave, which is basically the beginning of January for the Eastern Front. So, like I said, neglected that in the case of 1st SS, didn't I? I'm sorry. 10th Panzer is probably, a lot of you know, ends up going to Tunisia. Okay. So anyway, so the ones that are in dark bold are the 300 series, so-called Bodenständig or static divisions. That means they're not meant to maneuver in the field at all. They're just they're right there. They're not going anywhere. They don't really have, they're not equipped or trained for any kind of movement. Okay, and they usually have around a little under 9,000 men typically. Their equipment is generally captured equipment. A lot of them have Czech, from Czechoslovakia, their artillery, which are basically a pre-World War I Austro-Hungarian provenance. So it's not the most modern. They have modern carriages, or more modern carriages, but they're old guns. So there's 9 of those guarding the coastline. There's 6 700 series. You can see those are in red. And those are also Bodenständig, and they're even weaker than the 300 series. They really aren't going anywhere, and they're not, they're obviously less men. So that's probably, for overall, they're at the bottom or close to the bottom of the barrel of German field divisions, the 700 series. Okay, there's 2 standard divisions, and I neglected to put in there 3 Panzer divisions and the 2 SS motorized divisions, which are in various stages of recomposition. I would say overall, most of them are in pretty good shape, especially 10th Panzer is probably as good as any Panzer division there is at the time. I would like to say differently, but that's just the way it is. Now, the average coastal frontage was 84 miles. If you look up on the 302nd Division, which is down the lower left-hand corner, that was the one guarding Dieppe. When the raid went down, they had a frontage of 47 miles, so it was less than average. The 320th Infantry Division, which, as you might imagine, is organized pretty much the same, they had 149 miles of frontage to guard. So I think you can imagine and understand with, of military operations, that is a lot of frontage to guard for one understrength division. Okay, I'm just going to make a quick comparison. I mean, I've got this map from, I guess, the German archives is where I came up with it, of Normandy on May 5th, 1944. As I mentioned, the 320th was guarding, the 320th Infantry Division was protecting the Cotentin Peninsula, the Cherbourg Peninsula. In 1942, it had a total of 8 infantry battalions guarding that. So think of that, 8. All right, what do we have on the eve of D-Day? 30 German combat battalions. So it's gone from 8 to 30, and those are all German. Those are not counting. There are some Ost troop in there, Eastern troops, but that's not in the 30. Those are in addition to. And they also have an independent Nebelwerfer regiment, an independent artillery regiment, and 1 independent artillery battalion. Okay, so it is packed full of troops. I think one of the things, sometimes when I read things or hear things extolling about how great Operation Fortitude was, I think back, because a lot of these units just arrived weeks before D-Day. Hitler is personally shoving as many troops as he can into Normandy and into the peninsula. So you see that big loop in the middle with the 91st, that's the 91st Luftland Division. That's basically just arrived in the middle of May, okay? In the upper right-hand corner is the Sturm, it's the special assault battalion for the 7th Army, and Hitler's also ordered that there, and that's just gotten there as well. That's, even though it's a battalion, it's probably closer to regimental strength. and its equipment and such. And they, along with the Nebelwerther Regiment, put up a hell of a fight when the 4th Infantry Division tried to move north after D-Day. So they really, realistically, I'm just going to touch on this really quickly because one of the things when you read Brooks' diaries, he's quite proud of himself that he's managed to get a 1-month delay in the launching of Overlord. Well, in that 1 month, they probably, the number of battalions went up probably by 50%. And if you if you think about it, the actual combat power, available to block a severing of the peninsula is probably greater than that, because most of the other battalions are oriented outwards on looking for an amphibious attack. So I just feel like that's one of the inflection points, one of the lost opportunities. In fact, realistically, I think there's a case to be made that you should have been moving heaven and earth to get it moved up a month or whatever. It's very unusual if you think about in the history of combat, is people bragging about delaying. It's usually sooner is better. Okay, here's just a quick snapshot because I want to touch on one other period of time. This is July 5th of 1943. Sorry, it's not in color. Some of these shading here, I'm familiar with this. You get it. I have this in microfilm, and a couple of times I've been able to go back to Freiburg and get the original, and you have the color there, and you really can understand some of the color coding. It makes it more understandable. But I'm just going to give you that date because a good friend of mine wrote an excellent article for Naval History magazine a couple of years ago about the possibility of a 1943 invasion. And so I'm just kind of giving you the German side of the equation in July. So instead of going to Sicily, which, by the way, that had more divisions, that 7 divisions, in landing vessels, landing ships, than any other, than Overlord, which only had 5. Of course, it didn't build up at the same level, but there was a lot of amphibious resources by then. So, for instance, if you look at something like LSTs, which is supposedly the limiting factor on these operations, there was around 220 for Overlord, and the Americans have already built more than that by mid-May of 1943. So LCTs, everything, all the landing craft that they would have needed was there and available. So that objection doesn't really apply here. And so what I want to illustrate that is you can see here the 716th Division in the area of Omaha, Sword, Gold, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, which it was there in 1944. But of course, you had another division, the 352nd, I guess it was. You do see the 389th Division there, but that is just in formation. That's not really a combat-ready unit. It even makes reference to it on the map that it's in Aufstellung, so that means it's just forming. And it's, as a matter of fact, it never does end up forming. I don't know why it goes away. And on the peninsula, you have the 709th, which was also there. I think I can go back. Oops, wrong way. So the 709th is right there, but you've got 2 more divisions. You've got the 6th, you got the 6th Fallschirmjäger regiment and lots of other units. So it's there by its lonesome. It's obviously much more. And again, you can see all these flags are up in the north. They're defending up here. Okay. So I guess one thing I failed to mention is that, Normandy, pretty much after the meetings in July of 42, the consensus is that Normandy is going to be the place to land. People are probably familiar with General Morgan and his planning and such, and how he came up with that. But there was, in between, there was another, there was General Paget's plan, which also looked at who was the succeeded Brooke as the head of the British Home Forces for the British Army. And he had a plan that somewhat prefigured Overlord. All right, just to show you one other thing, here's a screenshot of a German document at the time. And the one thing I want to show is how many divisions. This is from July 7th, just a few days after that map. 25 divisions in the West, okay, including the Netherlands. 1 Panzer division. 1. Why is that? Obviously, there's the Battle of Kursk, right? That's one thing that I think a lot of historians fail to take into consideration is the, what's going on the Eastern Front. It's all about us. It's very self-directed. Okay, so again, peak Germany. Here we are. This is a graph showing German war production, in some very important areas: weapons, tanks, aircraft, et cetera, et cetera. Well, here we are in 1942. Look at 1942. And here we are later in the war. I mean, it's obvious which is more advantageous in that respect anyway. Just to drill down on that a little bit, here's small arms ammunition. 1944, it's quadruple. This would be like machine guns and rifles and pistols and such. It's quadruple what it is in 1942. This is I'm sorry, I deleted a typo. This is the number of armored fighting vehicles in France. In 400 in the fall of 1942, and 2,000 in the spring of 1944. They are doing what Hitler wanted. They're reorienting. Not only is there more resources because the production's higher, but they're reorienting more towards the West, okay, as of the fall of 1943. So anything before that is, substantially different. Not only is there more tanks, there are better tanks. Approximately 70 to 75% of the tanks in a Panzer division are the Mark III, okay, which by early 43, they're starting to phase out. It's down to maybe 30% in the spring. And by 1944, you just see the odd one here or there. They're like command vehicles or something, okay? So that is definitely not, that is, the Allies, on the other hand, pretty much have the same armor in 1942 as they have in 44. They have the Sherman, and the British have various models, but you pick out the Churchill as their top tank. Okay, Churchill tanks landed at Dieppe. That was their top vehicle. So the Germans had, in that case, the Sherman and the Churchill is definitely superior to the Mark III. But by 1944, you're seeing a lot of the Mark III is gone, and every German tank can outgun virtually every American and British tank, save the British Fireflies. Okay, so it's a huge change to the advantage of the Germans. And here I'll give you here's a little more of a breakdown on the production. As you can see, a little bit confusing because the date scale's on the left. But anyway, you kind of have to read from bottom up. But you can see in 1942, that not only is the production less, but they're building mostly Mark IIIs, okay? In 1944, no more Mark IIIs. The two biggest are the Mark IV with the long-barreled 75mm that outguns any Anglo-American tank, except for the few Fireflies, which had its own problems because it was a conversion. But anyway, so you have the Mark IVs and the Panthers, and of course the Tigers, and even Tiger IIs, and even the assault guns had for the most part, with a very small exception, had high velocity 75mm guns that would outgun most Anglo-American tanks. Here's another way of looking at it. The weight of German armored fighting vehicle production in tons. In other words, you take each vehicle and you multiply it by its combat weight, and you aggregate the total. Again, look, it's 4 times as much in 1944. Okay, so again, I'm pushing back against this idea of, there's been all this attrition with the battles on the Eastern Front and, the Tunis Grad and all that, and of course the bombing campaign, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the bombing campaign may have decelerated the rate of increase, but it didn't stop it. Okay. So you might be asking yourself, well, Gary, you said there was a manpower crisis. So how is it there's big, and then you said there's a bigger army and they have more men in it and there's more military output or armaments output. How can that be? Well, it's basically the Germans further exploited the conquered territories. Okay, so that top line there at the top is the number of German male workers working, mostly in Germany, right? As you can see, that goes down. Even in early 1942, I believe there was about 5 million adult male German workers that were available for service, but they were doing vital armaments work. And as I think I alluded to, the armaments production was actually too low at the beginning of 42 for an extended war. Like I said, they weren't ready for a long war, so they have to reorient their war economy. Okay, so you see that line goes down. Well, and you can see the green lines going up. So that means, again, the Wehrmacht continues to grow. At least if you use this as a metric, the number of men in the Wehrmacht, it keeps going up. Okay, that is pretty much the peak at May 1st of 1944. It does start to go down, no question about that. But that's on the eve of D-Day. And how do they do that? Well, they bring over more foreign workers. Okay, they already have been doing that, but in the beginning of 42, they realized, my God, we really have to crack down. But that took time. There's the logistics of doing it. There's the transporting. There's the training of the people in their new jobs, and then over time, their productivity gets better as they learn their jobs as well. But like, for instance, one of their best sources of labor, because of the high skill of the workforce, was France. Well, France wouldn't go when Darlan was head of government. They wouldn't go along with that, and that might have been one of the reasons he was replaced by Laval. But even Laval himself, it took a while. He wanted to kind of put his own stamp on it, and that delayed things for a few months. So they don't really get going. They don't. If you finally, the Germans put their foot down and they say, we're going to do conscription, and we don't care what you wanted, how you want to do it. We're just going to start taking people out of the workforce. But that didn't really start getting going until the end of 1942, and didn't really kick into high gear until 1943. So it took time for this to happen. And I just want to mention one other really important thing that it's not appreciated, especially when we talk about this Mediterranean campaign and the the invasion of Italy. So when Italy, changed sides in September of 1943, the Germans, basically captured all of the German army, and they deported 700,000 or 710,000 soldiers to work in Germany. Half of them arrived within 2 months. A study at the time showed that they had they had a 70% productivity rate compared to a German worker. So that freed up 500,000 men for service in the Wehrmacht. So basically, the sources I've seen, which I'm not saying are authoritative, says that the German forces in Italy during most of the campaign was about 350,000. So basically the Allies financed, from a manpower standpoint, the Italian campaign for the Germans. Okay, so I think that's one thing we don't really. And the other thing is they found they were both sort of enraged and pleasantly surprised to find the Italians have been, salting away large quantities of fuel, and so of course they didn't know that, and they were upset because the Italians were always begging for more fuel. But on the other hand, they realized quite the windfall there unexpectedly. Okay, so this may be difficult to see, but again, this is my chart by reading from top to bottom with the dates. As you can see, the number of Luftwaffe planes that are combat ready is around 4,000 here in the fall of 1942, and it goes down from there. All right, if we look up in 1944, it's 30% more. The defeated Luftwaffe has more operational planes than in 1942. Now, of course, you could say that's misleading, and it is in a way. I mean, obviously, the main factor that would be misleading is that the balance of forces are so much tilted in the the Anglo-American favor at that point in time in 1944. But it's just, it kind of goes against the grain. But we're gonna, and I think we're gonna talk a little bit more about that too. So, okay, so what about, as Greg probably knows better than me, Britain alone outproduced Germany in aircraft by 50% or more in each of the years 40 to 42. I think in 41 was close to double. In the fall of 1942, the German Air Force only had around 1,000 fighter pilots ready for combat, which, by the way, that number never really changes that much. It never gets to like 1,500 or 2,000 or, you know, at the best of times. Okay, so they only have about 1,000 fighter pilots ready for combat, while the RAF alone has over 6,000 trained fighter pilots, at least according to the document that I have. Now, of course, all of them are not flying, but I think the idea was they'd had the near-death experience in the Battle of Britain with the shortage of fighter pilots, and they were just going to train up a whole big reserve. And actually, you see in the documents that the numbers of trainees are starting to decline in the end of 1942, because I think they realized they have more than enough. But anyway, that just gives you an idea of the sort of resiliency built into the RAF, not just the RAF, not counting the Soviet Air Force or the US Army Air Force. Okay, so Greg, look at this. I put a quote in from you. I just saw this last night. Everything, my God, we're on the same wavelength. The fighter command, you know, was without doubt the most powerful concentration of day fighters on any Allied front. Indeed, this has been the case throughout the war. Yet it was also the greatest unused Allied resource. Okay, I'm going to disagree with that a little bit, only because I think it should be a broader statement than that. And what I'm saying is in 1942, the greatest concentration of air power anywhere in the world by far was in southern England. And this was before large numbers of US Army Air Force aircraft arrived. In fact, at that point in time, as far as I can tell, they hadn't shipped a single, they'd shipped close to 1,500, when I say literally shipped by ship, 1,500 planes for the US Army Air Force alone to the Pacific. That's not counting the Navy or the Marines. But they had shipped 0 for their own use to Great Britain. They were flying there, but they were flying Spitfires. And then later in the summer, they actually had some P-38s, believe it or not, self-deployed via Greenland and Iceland, but they hadn't actually shipped any there until later in the year. By August 1942, nevertheless, already has over 1,100 heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, and 3 times the first line fighter as the German Air Force has single engine fighters. Okay, so I'm not suggesting that you know, they could snap a finger and get thousands of new fighters over there, but they can start. But what ends up happening is, well, we'll talk about that as we go along. Okay, so just in case you think it's just me and now me, I would say me before, now I can say, just in case you think it's just me and maybe Greg, I'll just bring in Murray Williamson here. By the end of October 42, in terms of its operational ready rate, its force structure, and its attrition thus far in the year, the Luftwaffe was dangerously overextended, just like the Army, okay? In 1942, the Germans escaped the full consequences of their difficulties because the Anglo-American air forces found it difficult to come to grips with the Luftwaffe, except in peripheral theaters. Okay, so this is the first, one of the things I didn't really mention in my introduction is well, no, I did mention that. It's the strategy that screws things up, okay? So just as the 8th Air Force is starting to get a decent number of B-17s there and fighters, they have to split it in two because half of them have to go to North Africa, and that has its own set of problems, which we'll maybe touch upon as we go along. Okay, on the other side of the ledger, by the late summer of 1942, 4 out of 5 Luftwaffe fighter pilot schools have been closed down to lack of fuel. Okay, they are on fumes for a few months there. Okay, that means they don't have that many trained pilots to begin with, and they're not training new ones. That means they're particularly vulnerable to attrition at that point in time. Okay. All right, moving along here. Okay, so the British know this too. They've known it for a while. They've known they've got an advantage in the air. Okay. And that actually, in some respects, relates to the genesis of the Sledgehammer Plan to begin with, because from very early on, they wanted to make it. The problem had been they'd been doing all these fighter sweeps over France for I think Greg could I think it really got going in 1941, maybe in the second half of 41, but they were not really successful because basically the Germans didn't feel threatened by them, so they would only engage when they had a tactical advantage. So it basically allowed the Germans to sharpen their skills and run up their kill scores, and the British were extremely frustrated. So they're kind of realizing that there's a problem with the strategy, and they want to come up with a new one. They feel like, and as Greg's book, I just got the other day, so sorry for keep mentioning it, but as he mentions, and something I felt the same way about, was that and obviously the planners did as well, was when you get a ground campaign involved, that changes the calculus. The German Air Force can't just afford to engage when they feel like it. They have to engage even when they're not necessarily in an overwhelmingly tactical superior situation. Okay, so that's why the RAF puts their stamp on the original plans for Sledgehammer. What happened? Did I hit something on my keyboard? I need to go to the current slide. Okay. Okay, so you can see the object of from one of the earliest drafts was to cause protracted fighting in the air to reduce German air support available at the Eastern Front, and to realize this, this numerical superiority that they had. When we come to the July draft of the Sledgehammer Plan, they have that the RAF and the U.S. Army Air Force will enjoy a 7.5 to 1 advantage in fighter aircraft at the beginning of the operation. So that might be a little high, but it's not too high, but you'd also be a little low depending how you look at it, but we'll talk about that more next week. Here's another historian who's actually studied it as opposed to just commenting on it. He's weighing in on it, and he said even if Hitler had wanted to move more fighter resources to the West, he just couldn't because it was overstretched. Okay, it's not just me saying it. It's the historians have actually looked at it as opposed to just thinking they know that the Luftwaffe was not quote unquote defeated. Okay, so I'm going to now switch over real quick to the US side of the ledger. Okay, so sorry for this, it's not the greatest chart, but basically, all right, so there's the idea, well, okay, great. So maybe the Germans aren't as well prepared in 1942, but the United States really hasn't geared up yet with their production. Well, that's false. Tank production peaks in 1942. And even if you look at these numbers, even look at the third quarter of of 1942, it's produced over 6,500 tanks. That's more than both sides in the Battle of Kursk in just 3 months. Okay, they're not content with that. They go up 50% greater in the fourth quarter. Okay, so I mean, if you look at this, it's like this big iron wave that's ready to crash down on the Wehrmacht or something. But realistically, I look at it a different way. I look at this as actually a huge failure on two levels. One, it's a failure plan. There's no way in the best of circumstances they could have ever used this many tanks. There just wasn't enough shipping to ship it overseas. And obviously it's completely out of sync with their current, planning, their current operational planning, the strategy. Okay. And I just think it's really remarkable if you think about this. I mean, really almost by the end of the third quarter, they've produced enough tanks. The US has produced enough tanks to equip all of the divisions that will fight in the ETO from June 6th of 44 to VE Day. I mean, that's really how many. And then they even do more the following quarter. So you think of those enormous number of tanks, and yet, it hit me the other day when I was looking at one of the battles in Tunisia, where they had 2 German panzer divisions fighting against, 1 battalion of Americans. And you think, okay, there's nothing that remarkable, 2 panzer divisions fighting side by side. That happens all the time. But literally, it's July of 1944 before the US Army has 2 armored divisions fighting the enemy at the same time. Think about that. July, to me, that's failure. That is a major sign of failure. You've got all these resources. And by the way, I'll have to add that Britain itself outproduced Germany in tanks in 1942, not to mention the Soviet Union. Okay, so here we go, Alex. You asked me about Clay Blair. Cargo shipping the North Atlantic convoys. So it doesn't really do much good to have stuff in the United States if you can't get it across. One of the tropes that you hear all the time is the U-boat war hasn't been more on U-boat. Well, people are not looking at it the right way. The cargo routes, the convoy routes in the North Atlantic between the United States and Britain are secure and have been secured since 1941. It's kind of hard to see in this little purple little spot there. It looks like an ink spot. Those are the losses. Okay, there's practically no losses on the North Atlantic convoy routes. Okay, what happened? Why was November of 1942 the worst of the year? Because they diverted all the mini convoy escorts to support the torch convoys, thus forcing 119 ships to sail individually. 70 of those got sunk. Okay, but those weren't. So again, it's the strategy that's screwing things up. It's the strategy of dispersion. Okay, they had something that was working. One thing I didn't put in here is already by September of 1942, the U.S. Army, just for its own use, is landing 8,000 tons a day. My last video, I said a month, unfortunately. 8,000 tons a day in Great Britain. Okay, that's enough to support 15 divisions, and that's in September. And by this time, the Liberty ship program is actually kicking into high gear and major. So really, what they need to do is, concentrate on one line of communication, secure that, and go from there. Okay, so I'm just going to, I feel like I have to, address the Dieppe situation. And because it comes up so often as an objection, I would say the shorthand way of looking at it is that there are 6 landing areas for the British at Dieppe, 3 inside the defensive perimeter and 3 outside. Okay, and the 3 outside, there's no problem. The 3 inside are kind of what everybody knows in the history, but the 3 ones outside, none of them have any problem of getting off the beach. There is no major resistance on the beach. Okay, we saw that before with the frontages of these divisions. They can't possibly cover that entire area. Okay, the British just decided to the planners for Jubilee decided to do a frontal attack on one of the few places along the coast that's really well defended. So that shouldn't be surprising. So this is a little, this is an image of the landing area on the Cotentin Peninsula for Sledgehammer at the time that Sledgehammer went down. Those are like literally like individual weapons. This is like a platoon. So they're going to have platoons going up against 2 battalions. That's the plan. It's not going to be like Dieppe. That's just not, that's just not going to happen. Here's a picture of the beach frontage where they were going to land. You can see where the high tide is there. They're going to land at night. Okay. So where would you, and I think most of you are probably already familiar with the large cliffs at Dieppe. Terrain matters in ground combat. And here, the Atlantic Wall, this is a map showing, again, in September of 1942, it's kind of hard to tell, but these little dots are either completed or halfway completed, fortifications. Most of the coastline is not, it's all in planning stage. As a matter of fact, most of it's done in 43 and the first few months of 44. Okay, so I'm just gonna skip over this, but just if you want to come earlier, hey, no beach obstacles, no inundations. Inundations weren't really a problem for the men, but they were for the supply. The trucks would get stuck or roll off the side of the road. There's none of these big artillery buckets. They're all in open emplacements, very vulnerable to naval gunfire or to bombing. You don't have lots. These are just a sample of some of the weapons they could have avoided by coming in 42 or 43. These as well. And then I also mentioned the pressure mines, which is something that doesn't really get much notice, but that was actually one of the major problems that the Allies had to deal with in supplying in 1944. They had to come up with a new type of pressure mine, which was basically impossible to sweep. They never did really learn how to sweep. You basically had to get divers down there, but you had to find them first. And usually you were finding them when a ship blew up. So those didn't exist until sometime in 1943. Okay, so the other argument is, oh my God, those inexperienced Americans, they were so inept. And didn't we see, and I could talk it on and on. I can see now I'm already over where I was going to go, but these are various quotes from Rommel about his first contact with American forces. Okay, I'm not going to read them all because of time, but I'll just go right down to the third quote. Where he says, American troops made up for their lack of experience by their far better and more plentiful equipment. And as you see in my title, I call this America Light, because in fact, they didn't really have their full equipment. They didn't have the full measure of the resources that they would have in normal combat, okay? So he's talking about their more plentiful equipment, their tactically more flexible command, surprise, surprise. In fact, their armament in anti-tank weapons and armored vehicles was so enormous that we could look forward with but small hopes of success. Okay, so, hey, who are we gonna believe? The guy who was fighting them or a bunch of historians afterwards? Okay, which is not to say, there are some quotes where he does acknowledge some of their defects at the time, but he's basically struck by how fast they recover. And the other thing he mentions here is just, but we won't go over, is really the how well the American artillery performed in their first contact. Okay, so again, this whole idea they improved. Well, they didn't. I mean, I think all the evidence is there's minimal evidence there was any significant improvement between the earliest contact and Overlord. There's just a whole bunch of things here. I mean, this is just a partial list of all the things that I've identified where they did not learn the lesson. Okay, so I'm not going to go over all these things, but one of the things, for instance, you hear put forth is they learned all these lessons from Dieppe. Well, the Allies actually were able to capture the post-action report of the division commander at Dieppe and translate it. It was available in months before Overlord. And one of the things he mentioned was that the smoke that the RAF planes had dropped on the beaches had actually really given them a lot of problems. Okay, so you would think, and you can even see in the copy that you can get from the British National Archive, you can see where some intelligence officer has made a comment next to that, like, oh, this is, we should note this is important. Well, have you ever heard anything about smoke? No, they did not use smoke. It was not a new technology. Obviously they had it, they could use it. You had a much bigger problem because of all the obstacles. Again, waiting, you get the other side gets their vote and they're putting in obstacles and mines and such like that. So now you have to land near a low tide and you have a longer beach to go against. Okay, so wouldn't smoke come in handy? Well, you could say that's just theoretical, Gary, but in fact, it's not, because what ends up happening at Omaha Beach is some of the grass catches fire. That's just by accident. And that the numerous accounts have shown that that was actually very beneficial to the landing troops there. So I could go over and over it. The logistical plan did not work. It all had to be just, who knows how many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of man hours went into the logistical planning, and it did not work. It didn't work for the supplies. It didn't work for the manpower, and they just had to, they threw them out and just started from scratch. So, you know, all the enthusing over planning and such is somewhat misplaced in my opinion. Okay, so this is more of the same. Just gonna go. Here is one of the Allies' trump cards, and that is their ability to use naval gunfire. I'm putting these three here because these are all warships that were modern warships, but they were available as early as Torch. So, and they were used in an Operation Torch. Okay, so as you can see here is a quote from Geyer von Schreckenberg, you know, a panzer division is no match for naval artillery. Okay, and you know, we don't have time to go into it, but it's just, it really is a trump card for the Allies that they had available in 1940. They built a lot of cruisers and battleships. The battleships left over from quote unquote old battleships left over that had tremendous amount of firepower that were not really being used, or you could say they were used in Torch. So obviously they're available for Torch, as these ships and other large surface warships were. They would be available for Sledgehammer. Okay, I want to talk about the American and really the British way of war to a certain extent. So it's based on their self-image as advanced industrial nations, and they always tried to, you know, substitute metal for flesh. They wanted logistical and material dominance, mechanization. You know, the German army was still mostly using horses with carts. You know, already in the Battle of France, the British army has no horses. They're completely motorized. Of course, the United States is the same. It's based on heavy firepower, air superiority, heavy use of artillery for ground operations, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so it's particularly well suited for the type of positional warfare German officers typically instinctively avoided. And of course, this is what you would see in the Normandy campaign. Okay, and especially with the train there. Again, train's important. And I'm just going to put this statement out there, and I just think the Germans never defeated the Anglo-Americans at the operational level when quote unquote balanced dispositions maintained. That was sort of, you know, Montgomery's big obsession. But basically, if you're a modern army and you don't leave a vulnerability, you cover all your frontage, you have firepower, you're relatively well manned. You know, panzer divisions aren't battering rams. Okay, they're not typically well suited for that. And even infantry divisions are going to, you know, they can only do so much in the face of the kind of firepower that Anglo-Americans had organically, not even counting the naval gunfire they could bring into it. Okay. Okay. So I have a quote there of Rommel that kind of basically validates what I was just saying, but we're going to move on. So what kind of a campaign would we set up, let's say by Sledgehammer or even maybe a later version? pre-1944. Okay, here's a quote from Moltke the Elder. Skillful leadership will, in many cases, succeed in selecting defensive positions. Sorry, I guess I left the word, that are strategically of such an offensive nature that the opponent will be forced to attack them. Oh my God, lots of problems with this. Sorry. We will then take the tactical offensive only after casualties, loss of cohesion, exhaustion have weakened them. It goes back to the Clausewitz's idea that the defense is the stronger form of warfare. And that's still true. Yes, offense has wider scope when they get their way. But when you think about modern weaponry, when you go force on force with modern weaponry, in 1940s, it's very destructive, especially with artillery. And so this is, I don't think that the Allies really envisioned this, but Sledgehammer and possibly a 43 invasion is basically setting up this type of campaign that's going to neutralize the strengths of the Germans in mobile warfare and maximize their own strengths and material and firepower based positional warfare. Okay, so when the objection is made, oh well, Hitler will want to really knock it to the Allies if they land. Well, first of all, I would say that Hitler didn't always, he really wanted to capture Stalingrad too. That didn't work out, did it? So just because Hitler really wanted to do it, but in a sense, it almost works to their advantage, because what you want to do is wear down those units, and essentially that's the way it worked out. And even though it was a slightly different campaign, it was entirely defensive from the beginning, but you can see it's an attritional campaign in which the counterattacking of the Germans is often what caused them the most casualties, and eventually, led them to the attrition rate that led them to the breaking point that allowed the Anglo-Americans to break out. Okay, I'm going to skip this because we can go over this next week, I guess. We're getting almost done. So again, what's the opportunity? You have an opportunity to really have a global war. You have to combine, at least at a very high level, the activities of the Anglo-Americans with what's going on the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front is a huge war by itself. You get rid of the rest of World War II, it's probably the second biggest war in history, coming in a close second with the First World War. Okay, so it's sort of amazing to me that so many historians will comment on this and not really relate it to what's going on in the Eastern Front. I mean, just think about it for 1 second. Would you like to have even a minimal toehold on the continent at the time Sixth Army is surrounded at Stalingrad? The question almost answers itself. That's a huge opportunity for the Allies. And as anyone knows the history of the Eastern Front, it didn't just all, it was a crisis there from basically the end of November till well into February, where it looked like things were going to completely fall apart. Okay, so as I mentioned, as you saw before on that chart, there's quite a number of these divisions that did go to the Eastern Front. And they played a lot of them were the 300 divisions. They were actually reorganized. They were given additional training and equipment, upgrade a little. They had got cadre of experienced personnel, because most of them were completely inexperienced. And then they were shipped to the Eastern Front. But most of them were still put on what were quiet sectors. One of them that wasn't so lucky was the 320th. It got there in February and immediately got overwhelmed by the Soviet, the Red Army. But anyway, the 6th Panzer is a crucial division. I maintain, we'll talk about this more next week, that basically all the Sledgehammer Force had to do was keep the German divisions that are already in France there. They didn't have to transfer one division to have a major impact on the fighting on the Eastern Front. But again, we're going to go into that next week. we can skip this, I guess. This is just a little joke of mine, which is basically, the British were all for the Americans to go into the Mediterranean in the First World War too, and that's the time they didn't take the advice. So anyway, I just want to end on this note, and that is that there was a lot of impetus amongst the public, especially in Great Britain, but also in the United States. You can see it where you feel like there's public opinion is pressuring the politicians to go forward with this. So maybe the common man knew something that the leaders didn't. Of course, that's all counterfactual. We never know. We can never know what would have happened. And so in any of these situations, because one little thing change here could change a little thing there. I could push back on that in a lot of different ways, but of course, and again, ultimately we'll never know. But I hope that I feel like my presentation today has enlightened you on a few different things, and maybe we'll have a nice discussion now. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I can see a few comments from Brandon in the chat, and yeah, so we will get to Vincent, Brandon. But yeah, so let me just kind of start with, I think, other people may bring out two issues in my mind. One of which is the logistics of the land once the Americans and British were ashore, which is okay. In 42, you don't have the Mulberry. You would not have it would take some time to take Cherbourg, or major, one thing would be the major port. You would push supplies over. So maybe we can leave that question. You want to get into that more next week, Gary, but I'll just put that out there again.
No, I do have quite a bit of information on both of those subjects, so it's
okay. But let me just
it's a natural question, but there is
the other question is, in 44 you had the time to do the transportation plan, all the interdiction, the hitting their railroad marshalling yards, and so on, which did have effect on the ability of the Germans to reinforce Normandy. So not having done that, doesn't that make a big difference? Yeah. And then we'll start taking questions.
So would you like me to answer that first?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Whatever order you want.
Well, they actually do, and so one thing since I droned on and on, I wasn't able to emphasize is, already mostly the British, but the Americans are starting to bring over some of their B-17s. They have not quite 200, I think, in October. I think they hit 200 in October. But they do have kind of a mini transportation plan in the July Sledgehammer Plan. They have identified various transportation nodes. They're already talking about dropping bridges in areas across the Seine that would not be quote unquote compromising. In other words, it's not going to tell them where they're going to land. You have to realize there's only 2 rail lines that go into Normandy. Okay, I think you also do not have Operation Crossbow to divide your attention, right? So now there is no way they're going to be able to put up the same level of effort. Okay, but there's another way of looking at this. There's many more resources in 1944. So one way to eliminate your enemy's resources is to get there before he has them. Okay, so if you're low on fuel, we didn't really go on the fuel aspect of it, which we will next week. If you have a systemic fuel crisis, which they did starting in September and lasting until kind of the beginning of November, when it eased a little bit, when you have a systemic fuel crisis like that, and again, one of the areas I didn't really go into, which I will next week, was the fact that or I didn't emphasize, I mentioned in the very first slide, they have they kind of have it embedded in their psychology that any first landing is very likely a diversion, okay, or at least could be, okay. So are you going to use? So they kind of have a dilemma. First of all, they're saying you can already see it in the reports. It's like everything that when they move around troops, they try to move by rail, and they specifically say as a fuel conservation measure, they want to move them by rail. But both Rundstedt and Hitler don't really want to move troops by rail if there's an invasion, because they're afraid that the French railway workers will sabotage it, or get out in the middle somewhere and leave the locomotive, and et cetera, et cetera. And it might have been overblown, but they kind of have that dilemma. Plus, you have to realize that like an armored division takes upwards of 70 trains. Okay, not 70 train cars, but 70 full trains with dozens and scores of trains on it, right? Just to move. Okay, so they do have, again, they don't have a lot of fighters, and the Allies are going to have two different kinds of fighters that are long range, that can do long range interdiction on the rail. One of them is already doing it on a small scale, which is the Mustang ones. Okay, so that's one of the resources that really not being leveraged at all. But and then also P-38s that are deploying there. So is it going to be as good? No, but I think that the main problem is going to be when it comes to air, when it comes to putting resources in there. There's always going to be the idea. It's like, well, is this the real thing? Do we want to send everything there? Especially when you think about the terrain. There's always the idea, once your forces are engaged, they're difficult to disengage, and that goes more when the terrain is difficult. Okay, so I think that's going to hinder them in those first opening days at least. So anyway, also I would like to mention that I don't know if you're familiar with Zetterling's work, Normandy, 1944, and he goes into some works that I'm also familiar with, some other scholarships that have been done more recently, that it doesn't discount completely what you just said, but basically discounts it to a certain extent, that maybe the aerial campaign, the interdiction campaign, was not as effective as some of the advocates said afterwards.
Okay, so let's move on to question. And everybody, you can use the reaction button. Again, kind of should be on the bottom of your Zoom thing, and to raise your hand for questions that you want to ask. So we can do it in order. So let's start with Roberto first. Unmute.
Hi, how are you? So very compelling, I have to say. And the only issue is that you use the whole 1942 for your dates, but then I saw somebody on the comments, you're not going to land in December, right? I mean, you have to make allowance for weather. So it would have been a little more useful to know for the window of opportunity for landing, which is, I guess June, May, July, whatever, the actual, German dispositions and whatever, because you extend some of units, they move in November to Russia. Well, but obviously they wouldn't have if the invasion had happened in June. So there, I mean, I imagine that there's only a short, maybe 4-month period where the Allies could have done this before jumping to 43, just because of weather considerations. But other than that, yeah, I think wow, it's interesting to rethink what till now was standard thought on this, because it's true. You think the P-51 was critical, but the P-47 and P-38s were quite capable airplanes in terms of range, at least for the local Battle of Normandy, right? Maybe not moving forward beyond, until you get your landing strips within the continent. And then actually regarding was the original plan of Sledgehammer to use a port? Because I know in 1942 when Higgins was building his boats, at the beginning the Navy was not very interested, because they said, well, we're going to capture port. We're going to behave like we did in France in 1917, right? In 1918, we're going to go directly to French ports and unload our troops. We don't need landing craft. So was part of the plan really capture a port? But Dieppe, I guess, showed that was not a possibility from the get-go, right? You have to go to open beaches, right?
Oh, okay, so let me answer some of your questions here, because I'm going to start forgetting to answer anymore.
Sorry.
First of all, I guess maybe you missed that part, or maybe I didn't explain it very well, but it was scheduled to, Sledgehammer was scheduled, would have gone down. Well, there's various dates that were proposed because the British were talking about it as early as March. And so they're talking about doing maybe in June, maybe in July, maybe in August. But by the time we get to the decisive meetings that were in July in London between the top brass, and that ended up canceling Sledgehammer definitively in favor of Gymnast, redubbed Torch. If that had gone forward at that point in time, the almost for sure the date would have been October 5th, 1942. And I have the weather, which by the way, the planners said that that's not too late in the season based upon climatological records. The Germans are, I have Rundstedt saying the same thing. So this is our third season here. And we know for sure October is still very viable. So don't let your guard down. And I do have the weather records from both sides of the channel that confirm that actually the weather is pretty good. There's a couple of spots in there. But basically it's very good from October 4th or 5th all the way to the end of November, which is the last I started looking at it. And actually there isn't even as bad of a storm as you had in June 19th and 20th of 44. Okay. So they are going to land on an open beach. One of the canards, one of the self-serving claims from Mountbatten is that, the Germans were fooled by Dieppe into thinking that, we were going to go make a frontal attack on a port. And so they emphasized their defensive buildup on ports. So that it's exactly the opposite. That was the first thing that they covered was the ports, okay, like Dieppe. Okay, and so one of the things I didn't get into is that, again, relates to the strategy. Part of the strategy of the go slow port approach was to have these raids, and for whatever reason, to boost morale, maybe sometimes to get intelligence, whatever. But a raid is not the same as an invasion. It has different operational and political goals, okay? So you see specifically in the Sledgehammer Plan in July, so obviously it's before Dieppe, it's not learned from Dieppe. They don't even consider a frontal attack on Cherbourg because they say, hey, that's likely where they're going to be the strongest. Let's go someplace where they're not strong. Duh. Okay, so they didn't have to, the Allies didn't have to learn that, and the Germans learned, they built up their defenses much more in between the ports, before Overlord. It was the other way around. But yes, they were, we're going to go into the logistical stuff more next week because that's a whole conversation in itself. But they were going to land on a open beach, and yes, they were planning to capture Cherbourg as quickly as possible. And if you look at, I didn't really bring up one of the maps, but if you look at, I have all the German information from that side of the equation. And basically the middle of the peninsula is like a big donut hole. Okay. There's only 8 battalions, right? And actually 3 of those battalions have been taken away from the 320th Division and put in Corps Reserve. So they don't even have control over 3 of their normal 9 battalions. Okay. And all the rest of them are oriented outwards. Most of them are oriented on the north coast. So they're not going to land there. They're going to land in sort of in a flanking thing and come in behind, and they're hoping to capture Cherbourg in 2 to 3 days. Now, I think that's actually very viable. Of course, you don't know what's going to happen, so you don't really know. But yes, they're going to capture Cherbourg as quickly as possible. And of course, as you may know, that's one of the 2 main ports on the Channel Coast, and it proved able to do 15,000 tons a day in 1944, and there's 2 other minor ports in the northeast corner of the Cotentin Peninsula, and their combined capacity, as demonstrated post-Overlord, was around 4,000 tons. So that's almost 20,000 tons of capacity. So I think I answered all your questions. Maybe
Very good.
I forgot one.
Thank you.
Great. So Mike, unmute and go. Mike, you're still muted. There you go.
muted. Well, Gary, I gotta say, I'm
Mike,
still-
I have this impression that you're just a handsome guy. Can I see what you look like?
the Screen Actors Guild prevents me from doing that.
Okay.
Well, I'm glad that you didn't focus this discussion on Sledgehammer. All kidding aside, let me just tell you that I don't know, I can't speak for how much the Americans learned, but the British, and to a large degree, many of the Canadians did learn lessons from DF. I can tell you, the Canadian side, that.
Yeah, I should have. I wanted to qualify it, but I was running down on time. But yes, I do think there are some areas where you could say they didn't, but I certainly hold out the prospect that they may have learned some lessons where the Americans hadn't.
They did. Anyway, so and I'm not going to go into the idea of German production figures, which I'm sure you know are often suspect, not always, but often suspect, for obvious reasons. But because you can increase production figures, but it doesn't mean quality of the actual production, but the quality of the design was up to par. So, and also as far as replacement parts. Also the fact that as of immediately after D-Day, one out of every, it was estimated, I suppose, 1 out of every 4 rounds fired from an MG-42 was made out of wood. So obviously by 44, they were having an ammunition problem. But
I'm sorry, could you repeat what you just said? I didn't, 1 out of 4 what?
1 out of every 4 rounds fired from an MG-42 was made out of wood.
In when, 1942 or 44?
44.
Okay.
Not that anybody would want to get hit by an MG-42 with even a wooden bullet. The question is, so we can look at all these interesting figures, which they make for a very good game, board game, but how many planes, how many aircraft did the Germans put up over the D-Day beaches on 6 June, or even in the days after, and the several days afterwards, before the beachhead, the crucial time when during the battle for the beachhead? How many planes did they put up versus how many did they put up at Dieppe? And also, how much intelligence did the Allies have as far as the landing areas and the landing areas they would be landing at in 1942 as to what they had gained in 1944, and how much coordination did they have with French resistance, and to how effective was the French resistance in 42 as opposed to 44? Those are just a couple of questions for you.
Okay, so if I wanted to do a gotcha, I would say that actually the German Air Force was able to put up more fighters in 1944. They moved over about 500-600, I think, fighters from Germany into France, but they were just, so the gotcha would be, yeah, there's no way, they only had 200, the Germans only had 200 at any given time, operational fighters, single engine fighters in France and the Low Countries in 1942. Okay, so there's no way they could get 600 in a few days, but that would be misleading. I agree, because by that time the Allies had built up so much. You follow? So it's really the balance of forces. That 600 was just swallowed up for the most part. It's not completely the story you hear what they did. Yeah, of course on the D-Day they didn't do that much. You want to talk about Dieppe? Okay. Dieppe was a much longer day. You had a bright, sunshiny sky, at least in the beginning of the day, as opposed to October 5th, where you have overcast skies, et cetera, et cetera. Plus, Dieppe is located at the perfect, if you're a German in the German Air Force and want to get all of your fighters to one spot, you couldn't have picked a better spot than Dieppe. It's at the foci of all these different fighter bases, basically all the fighter bases in northern France. Whereas at least we're talking, of course, right in the crucial first hours. Whereas the Cotentin Peninsula, probably less than half of them could get there. Okay, as I said, and we're going to talk about this in more detail next week, there was some high multiple of 5.5 or greater superiority in aircraft. Plus, part of the plan was to bomb their airfields. You know, surprise, surprise. Okay, but let's go back to Dieppe. And bomb the airfields at a much bigger scale than for Dieppe. You had two squadrons of American B-17s on literally their second mission ever out of England, bombing one airfield. And there's some, you know, discussion as to how much damage they did, but it seems that they might have done at least some disruption there. But in the Sledgehammer Plan, everything is on a much bigger scale. They're going to try to, especially the Americans, like, we got to bomb all these airfields, which of course, so that's the whole idea. We're going to repurpose all these big bombers from bombing civilians in Germany on this sort of Sisyphean task, and we're going to like bomb airfields, and we're going to bomb marshalling yards and transportation nodes and stuff like that. And literally, you know, you're probably familiar with the 1,000 plane raids earlier in the year. The RAF are saying, we'll do it on the first day of Sledgehammer, we're going to have 1,000 bomber missions. Okay, so that may not sound like great. It's not that great compared to Overlord. But if you look at the Mediterranean, the standard is not to meet what they did in 1944. The standard is to do enough to make the operation viable, to make it successful. Okay, and so if you compare it to the amphibious operations, the balance of powers, and the forces available, it's very comparable, and even more in some cases than what you see in the Mediterranean. Okay, also when it comes to the logistics, in October the nights are a lot longer, and they're going to get longer for the rest of the year, right, than they are in August. So the British are like, hey, we're going to try to do everything. If you look at the, you know, it's just a fact of geography. Hey, we can get our ships across, get the troops unloaded, and at least be halfway back before dawn. And we can leave, you know, like little before sunset and do all that. So they're not going to be exposed, you know, out there. Now, what I want to say about Dieppe is it's this perfect place for all the Germans. Okay, and so some people want to talk about the relative loss rate, but what was their mission? Their mission was to defeat the invasion. They didn't hit a single, even though they're out there for hours under a bright blue sky, they didn't hit one transport. There's one bomb hits one ship at the very end of the operation. I think it was it wasn't under the full air umbrella, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you know, who knows? So they absolutely failed in their mission. And if you look at the number of planes that were shot down, German planes, again, they're much more vulnerable. It's more than the average that you would see during the height of the bomber offensive in the spring of '44, being shot down by the P-51s. Okay, so it's a sort of loss that they could, you know, somewhat shrug off it to one day. But if they had to repeat it day after day, they could not sustain it, especially given the fact of what I just said about the fuel shortage, and there's nobody coming out of the pilot schools. It is true that they did shoot down more Allied planes that were, you know, by a factor of, you know, 2 at least. But you also have to take into consideration that a lot of the Allied planes were shot down by ground fire because there was a lot of anti-aircraft at Dieppe, and the plan called for all the planes to penetrate the coastline right over Dieppe, which was a mistake. I imagine they would have rectified that. But it doesn't matter, because on the where the Allies were going to land for Sledgehammer, there were no anti-aircraft, zero. I know that for a fact. So that reduces the disparity there. Plus, if you look at the actual loss rates per sortie, it's really not that much difference, because the Allies had far more sorties on the D-Day, on Dieppe, Jubilee, than the Germans. So that you know, reduces the margin of error, the margin of difference there as well. So anyway, Mike, you asked about other questions, and I got rolling on that one. I'm sorry, I probably forgot one or two of your other ones.
Right, and you didn't, the direction I was going in with the question on the air. Well, we'll leave it at that because I can leave that till next week.
Yeah.
But the one about that, the fact of question about how much intelligence did we have on the ground intelligence. Now this means,
Oh yeah, that's good. I remember because again from this report that by the German commanding officer at Dieppe, they did capture a full plan, a full Allied plan for the Dieppe operation, and what they said is like, wow. They really had, they knew everything. They knew where every pillbox was. They knew they had incredibly good intelligence on all of our defensive positions. Okay, so that's indicative of the capability. The other thing we're going to talk about next week is a little bit more is the Allies themselves had a double agent that was basically speaking right into Hitler's ear, and he was literally moving divisions around France. I know at least two specifically that can be linked to the false information this double agent was supplying. So from that end, they had pretty good counterintelligence. So anyway.
well, I mean, I was talking about, in other words, give you a perfect example, we were taking sand samples. We were putting
yeah, I think that's kind of overrated. And in fact, I know this beach, I'm just, I've been kind of coy about it, but basically where the beach they identified where they were going to land is Madeline Beach, also known as Utah Beach. And I think we can say with a fairly good, they had in the Sledgehammer Plan, there's pages of where they go over the characteristics of each of the beaches, how many LCTs it can handle, what the tidal range is, many of the characteristics. And obviously we know that Utah Beach worked just great. So whether or not they had the intelligence or not, they picked a place that was going to work.
I was just using that as an example. I'm saying that intelligence on not only on the ground intelligence, not only
as far as the forces, they had identified the forces. I've got the German maps from 1942 that shows the dispositions and the boundaries of all the different divisions and stuff, and I can overlay the British map and it's pretty much the same. You drill down onto the Cotentin Peninsula, and you see what they've estimated the forces are there. They're pretty darn close. They're pretty close. They pretty much know what the deal is. They have good intelligence, and that's one of the things I didn't even work into. That's one of the advantages of the angle. I talk about firepower and logistics and all that, but actually the other huge advantage they had was an intelligence. I mean, from the other, I look at because a lot of what I did is spend looking at German documents, and you look at what they're saying about the other side, and they are completely in the dark. They do not know what's going on.
Right.
Okay.
Huge advantage for the Allies.
Mike, let's somebody else get a chance. If we do have Vincent O'Hara, the naval historian out there, we'd love to get a question from you. Let's go to Ralph.
He's heard all this a million times, so
yeah. Ralph, ask your question.
Yes. Thanks. I have no military expertise whatsoever. So I mean, your argument sounds very convincing to me. I'd like to take a little bit of an historical comparison. I think of the German invasion of Poland at the start of the war, and what I can't help but think was a huge missed opportunity on the part of France and Britain, but particularly France, to not launch a major attack in the West when 2/3 to 3/4 of Germany's strength was focused on Poland. And that we know was a political failure. It was, France was most of the French public and politicians were not prepared to, they were averse to huge bloodshed, for understandable reasons after World War I. And this infected the army as well. But it was basically a political failure in 1939. And I'm wondering here in 42, 43, was this, would you characterize this as a political failure, or was it a lack of imagination on the part of the military planners?
Well, part of the backstory, which is very interesting, which I haven't gone into, because a lot of it is pretty much well covered by the historians that I can endorse, although I have a few little things we're going to go over next week. But the backstory is that the American top brass were rabid to do Sledgehammer, okay? And they were only stopped by pretty much resolute British opposition. And, whereas Roosevelt, at some points, it looks like maybe he's for it. He ultimately undercuts their position because he basically says, if they won't agree to this, if the British won't agree, then we're going to have to do something else. And I think the British kind of know that. And so all they have to do is just keep saying no, 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 no. And, so, yeah, I mean, the British were it just was not part of their strategy. And this is something that Greg has in his book a little bit, or I think he mentioned it the other day when I saw his presentation, was, the British have this strategy in 1940 that makes sense for 1940. Okay, they're quote unquote alone with 400 million in their empire, but they have no major industrial powers on their side or anything like that in 1940, end of 1940. Well, in the middle of 1941, the Soviet Union becomes an ally of them. That's something big right there, okay? That's hundreds and hundreds of divisions, ripping away at the common enemy. And then they get the United States. So at some point, you're like, don't you want to look at your strategy again and say, maybe we can revise it? But they're just adamant that they're going to win the war by bombing. Now Churchill isn't always 100% sold on that, but he still is, and he kind of goes in and out, but he sees that as a major, major component of their war strategy is the bombing. Okay. And, there's been a lot of comment in recent years about how immoral it was and this and that, but, I'm going to go back to that old statement. It was worse than immoral. It was a blunder. They had all these air resources that were hitting the wrong targets. Okay. Now, when you want to get into the political aspects of it, it's something I didn't really talk about, but even though it's I feel is the most interesting, is that, this whole second front thing, it was what was on people's, that's what people were talking about during the war. The phrase D-Day didn't really come in until after Overlord, okay? And it completely has eclipsed the phrase second front. It's, you'll see it in books and such, but the common person, even somebody who kind of has read a lot, has barely heard the second front. But that's what everybody was talking about. And it's because it was a major geopolitical issue. They were constantly getting asked by the Soviet government, by Stalin, by everybody, like, when's the second front going to come? When's the second front? When are we going to have the second front? Okay. And my position is that from a political standpoint, there was an opportunity missed that if there had been a landing before the counteroffensive at Stalingrad, the political impact of that would have been far beyond anything they could have possibly done afterwards. And I think that people, you're hearing all this stuff in Ukraine. Why don't you, you hear from Ukraine, well, close the skies, et cetera, et cetera. And why aren't you doing that? Okay, but it's that sort of times 10 because there is no threat of nuclear bombs. It's just like, hey, put your ass on the line. Okay, so Molotov has come over and met with Roosevelt and with Churchill, and they again, this is practically a sponge from the history books. It's there if you're looking, but it was in main news at the day where they had a joint communique that all the Allies were in agreement that there was going to be a second front in that year. Okay, but then it didn't happen. Okay, and so I think that basically you permanently embittered an entire population by not coming in 1942. Now, I think it could have been mitigated to a certain extent if they'd done in 43, but by 44, basically the attitude is you guys waited until it was easy. You know, but now, of course, a lot of my evidence is to the contrary of that. But from their perspective, it's like you waited till we fought and fought and fought, and now you could just come in the back door. And so screw you guys, you know. Plus from Stalin's standpoint, if you just look at it from that standpoint, I feel like he on the eve of D-Day, he's joking with one of his communist Yugoslavian communist interlocutor, and it's like, oh, there's going to be a wind, there's going to be a fog, and they're delayed again, So in other words, he really didn't believe, he correctly sized this up as being risk averse. Okay, so that's not something you really want to have with when you're dealing with someone like Stalin. Plus, if you go over not only was he misled in 1942, arguably, some people push against it, I think he was, but definitely in 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill were managing him, they were lying to him, they were manipulating him, and of course he finds out you cannot treat a guy of a major power, forget about being Stalin, just anybody like that, and expect to have good relations. And now it's not my foreign policy, it was Roosevelt's foreign policy, and believe it or not, Churchill's foreign policy at the time to have good relations with the Soviet Union. Well, they're basically shutting them out in every other way. Okay, they actually try to use supplies as a substitute for the second front, but they have to cut back on supplies for torch. Okay, so they're basically getting nothing that they're asking for, and they're saying we're doing all this fighting and all these dying, and you can't risk a few divisions, and so that was a major missed opportunity politically, in my opinion.
Okay,
Thanks.
let's go. Vincent, unmute and ask your question.
Hello, everybody. I'm sorry that I haven't been able to join any prior events, and I'm sorry that I came in an hour late here.
Oh, great you're here. We love your books, but yeah.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. So
okay, yeah, I'm in a country right now that's still on a normal time zone, not daylight time zone. I screwed up on my logistics. But in any case, I do want to say that I am pretty familiar with Gary's arguments. And even before I met Gary, I've always had this feeling that Sledgehammer and Roundup represented a better path forward than the Mediterranean option. And I really appreciate the facts and the information that Gary has amassed to support the idea that Sledgehammer in 1942 was a viable operation. And I agree with most of his points in this respect. I think the fact that if you can pull off Torch, even if it's in November, you can certainly pull off Sledgehammer a month before that. All the questions about sufficiency of shipping or sufficiency of troops, those are all false arguments in my opinion. I think that the reason Sledgehammer never happened is clearly a political decision, and I think the political decision was made by the British War Cabinet, and I really can't criticize them for their decisions. There was really no reason from the British worldview at that time to put a lot of risk into a continental operation. But that said, I still feel that the most direct way to end the war, to get it over as quickly as possible, would have been an operation in October 1942. And some of the things that Gary has brought forth, particularly the impact that this would have had on the Eastern Front, I think really reinforces that conclusion. So I appreciate this discussion. I really, really, really regret that I was not able to attend next week. And I'm trying to arrange things that I can attend last week, and I'm trying to arrange things so that I can attend next Saturday. But on the whole, I'm really happy to see this being discussed in such a high level and in such an intelligent way. And I think that there's a lot to be said for the points that Gary's making. I mean, this is basically an expression of support for Gary's point of view, or his research, I should say, in this matter.
Okay,
You want to say
great.
anything, Gary?
Yeah.
Thanks, Vince.
I wasn't looking for that. I
Pretty
really,
big
I
endorsement.
disagree with everything you said.
All right, so let's go to Jim next.
Well, thank you, Gary. I knew, of course, it would be provocative, and I have to chime in with Vincent, although there are differences I have with both of you, but I think it was a political decision primarily, and everything we read about it, certainly when we had Mark talk about it last week, that's the reason we chose Mark, because we wanted him to lay out some of what he felt were the political aspects of this. I don't see Churchill changing his mind at all during 1942 about this, because remember, we're dealing with Churchill coming into the United States, and what happens when he's in the United States? Tobruk falls, and we have the debates about what should happen with that, and I just find that the idea that it could happen, I accept the fact that a lot of your arguments make sense, but then what? You're on the continent of Europe. Then what? I just think that Hitler would have reacted with great speed, contained it. I know we're going to talk about this at greater length next week, but that to me is, and then of course we have the famous comment, I don't know if Churchill made that or Allenbrook made that, about it being compared to Passchendaele. Someone can correct me on that. Maybe David. I see David's throwing Passchendaele and the Somme in there, but to have them bottled up, what politically benefit would Churchill have? Because Churchill was not impregnable from political attack during the war. In fact, after the fall of Tobruk, he was attacked politically because of that. So that element of it, I think, has to be equally balanced with us going into, sort of very well-informed Monday morning quarterbacking about the military aspects of this. But again, it's great to hear you do your arguments.
Any response, Gary?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I mean, I really don't see any way Churchill's going to go along with it. So, like I've said in earlier, when we had our email discussions, it's like, if that ends the discussion, then we're done. There's no reason to talk about anything. I do think it's at least possible that he could have been, I think it's very possible that he could have been forced into it if, Stalin and Roosevelt got together like they did at Tehran, basically, and said, no, we're going to do this. But then Roosevelt's taking all the risk on himself, and I just don't see him doing that, so that's the answer to that one. As far as the getting sealed off, I really don't feel as though that would be a major political hit to him if it was just a quote unquote partial success. I mean, look at Italy in late 43 and 44. They didn't move practically an inch for 6 months, right? You had one group after another trying to take Monte Cassino, the Poles, the New Zealanders, the Americans, the British, and, one after another that failed, right? And didn't really move until for 6 months. And we forget about that now. I mean, we know it, but it's kind of an ellipsis in the history because we don't think about it. So the fact that they might have been pinned down there for X number of months, and I can't really say that they wouldn't have been, but on the other hand, I just feel like, as I was trying to mention during my presentation, that actually the longer that Hitler tries to drive them out, and the harder he tries to drive them out, that's actually going to work in their favor, because they are at the bottom of the manpower barrel at that point in time. The inflows of the foreign labor has not really gotten started. I mean, it has gotten started, but it's inching along where it really hits its stride later in the year and in 1943. Okay, so I think if they are attacking, they're going to be taking lots of casualties. Okay, it's become a attritional battle. It's going to be, I used to, refer to it as like potentially a Stalingrad in the hedgerows. you know? So even if they push them back some, if they're taking casualties, eventually they're going to exhaust themselves. That's why I brought in the von Moltke quote there. Okay, you can see on a more tactical level, but I guess even operationally, you could see how Rommel used that against the British in North Africa many times. You know, get them to, you know, yeah, sometimes he could go around their flank, but when that wasn't working, hey, get them to attack my strength, and I'll knock out all their tanks with my anti-tank guns. Okay, and then I'll counterattack. Okay, so it's the same idea. The defense is still the stronger form of warfare, especially in a positional battle like that, a force-on-force battle. So again, there's no way for us to say how it really would have taken place, but I just feel like if you look at it conceptually, it really does make sense for the Allies, that it maximizes their strengths and minimizes their weaknesses. And I don't feel as though, I think that the very fact that it's fulfilled the commitment to open a second front, even if it wasn't greatly successful from the get-go, which, by the way, I think if they had broken through right away, that would probably be the biggest way of losing the battle, if they tried to drive forward, because again, the Germans would have been to exploit their advantage in mobile warfare to cut them up. But they really need a positional battle. But I just think that there's a lot of political push. I feel like it would be a sensation within the Soviet Union. They're not going to say it was small and was stuck and this and that. They're just going to, you know, they could basically leverage all the propaganda that the Soviet Union had been using internally and externally about the second front to their advantage. You know, to me, it's like that propaganda is like potential energy. It can go either way. You know, it can work for you or it can work against you. Okay, as it turned out, it worked against him. But I think from a political standpoint, just to have realized, got a toehold on there, I think that in itself would be a sufficient positivity to carry them through any kind of difficulties they might have had in subsequent months. But that's just my opinion.
All right, let me just disagree with that, because
Okay.
the issue, Roosevelt did not want us to commit ourselves in a situation where we could get beaten immediately. I mean, that was something that always was present in his mind when he was debating with Marshall and the chiefs about the question of mounting a second front into Europe in 1942. That's why, in a way, Gymnast is, you know, the scholarship sort of says that he chooses, and, you know, Vincent can chime in on this, he chooses the operation to land in North Africa as a compromise to that kind of, in part to that kind of dilemma. Now, when you raise Italy, I mean, Italy was something where that was a good example of the United States, particularly being dragged into a situation which there was a lot of debate in the chiefs about having to go into Italy to start with. They were not necessarily enthusiastic about that. And then, of course, when Churchill spreads it to the Aegean, that's when Marshall puts the stop to that. And of course, we have the defeats in the Aegean in that period of time after the surrender of the Italians that, you know, was sort of an example of, well, this is so far, we're going to go with the underbelly. I just, again, you know, we just have a different approach to this. I think that a contained beachhead in Normandy without the ability to exploit the beachhead and actually do something equivalent to what we had in 1944 in France, which we did not have the buildup to do. And I just don't think that could have been feasible. But anyway, let other people talk.
Right. Well, I'm pretty sure Brandon's been chomping at the bit to ask a question. So, Brandon, you go.
You would be right about that. And I just want to preface what I'm saying. I'm a little bit confused because the discussion is sort of veering between grand, strategic, and then down to tactical considerations. I mean, in Gary's presentation, he went on to everything with 75mm guns on Panthers up to now we're discussing about, you know, what the relationship was between Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt. So I have a little bit of cognitive dissonance, but the thing I really want to ask to focus on just one little aspect here is the idea that there was no progress for the American Army between, say, when they landed on the beaches of Torch And 1944, I find really questionable. If you've ever read the first volume of Rick Atkinson's Liberation trilogy, An Army at Dawn, his depiction of what happened at Kasserine, which is the most vivid one I've read, it's sobering. And if, let's say you get the guys on the beaches, and instead of that happening at Kasserine, you know, it happens at Caen or whatever, they're driven back into the sea. And I see that as a major problem with your argument. And in general, you sort of like to short shrift the qualitative aspects of this discussion. You have a lot of fun with spreadsheets about who moved what, where, when, but you know, we had 2 years of attrition of the Luftwaffe by that point. And you can't just discount that. They barely showed up in the Normandy campaign, and when they did, it was at night. And there are many other things. I'm really shocked to hear what Vin said, which is that logistically there was no problem with all of the you know, the LCTs, the LSTs, and all that shipping that was necessary, because I thought that, now I've read and probably been misled by what I've read, that was a major issue. But logistics aside, I really do think qualitatively there's a big difference in the forces in 1944, and Alex put his finger on the most important thing, which is the absence of mulberries, which really did matter, in my opinion.
Okay.
So my question is, how do you account for that? What happened at Kasserine, and how can you say the American Army was as good as in 1944?
It's funny you should bring up Rick Atkinson, because I was at one of those conferences in New Orleans at the museum there. They have great conferences just from the standpoint of all the historians that come there that you get to talk to. And it just so happened one day I'm sitting in the, you know, and I look right next to me, and there's Rick Atkinson. I'm like, well, okay, geez, I'm going to get my chance to give my pitch. And so one of the things I didn't really mention was Sabiba. I don't know if you know about the Battle of Sabiba, but basically that's going on. That's the Schwerpunkt on the first day of the Battle of Kasserine Pass. Okay. And basically the 21st Panzer Division, which has been completely re-equipped. It's obviously a veteran, high quality division. They run into a hasty defense of an Anglo-American defense, looking something, you know, Anglo-American, just like they would have been in, let's say, in the Cotentin Peninsula, okay? And the 21st Panzer Division is basically stopped in its tracks before it even gets going, okay? And then the next day they try again and again. They make a shallow penetration, and they're stopped cold. Okay, so I, you know, ventured to, you know, talk to Rick Atkinson. I said, you know, really, if you look at Kasserine, that's not representative. That's a what the Americans could do. It's a grab bag of units that are thrown together at the last minute. Okay, they don't necessarily know each other. They don't know their commanders, some of them aren't even really combat troops. And if you look at it, it's not like they melted on first contact with the enemy. They kept them out for almost the better part of 2 days. Okay, and I glossed over the quote of Rommel. So my counter is, well, look what Rommel said. Okay, so I can go into more circumstances. There's the whole idea that Rommel had a temporary advantage where he had brought his two armies together, you know, the 5th Panzer Army and his army, and to concentrate against one of the Allied armies while Montgomery was slowly, closing, right? So he had an ability, he had a temporary advantage, and he happened to find a weak spot, okay? Again, they didn't exactly melt at first contact. But nevertheless, I'm saying, hey, what's the truth? If you really want to grade how the Americans would do, or the Anglo-Americans would do against the Germans, and then you've got to look at Sabiba, because that's really more typical of what those are not, maybe not divisions fighting as divisions, but at least regiments fighting as regiments. Okay, so you have regularly organized troops, and they had no problem. And he said, oh, yeah, I think that's a, you know, you might be right about that. Okay, well, okay, maybe he's just being polite. I thought that was nice. I enjoyed him saying that. But then later on, I'm walking by his table when he's signing books, and he stops me and he says, "You know what? I think you really have something of that Saviva thing. Yeah, I think you have something there." So maybe again, he's just being polite. But that's always been my position. Once I really started to look at the Kasserine thing, that's totally overblown. I would just like to throw it back to you, though. I mean, I'm still looking from actual combat experience. Look at I can find even amongst historians that maintain that there was this great improvement. And I'm not saying there was none. I never have said there was none. I'm just not saying I don't see any great significant improvements. I'm saying they have basically the same strengths and weaknesses. But I would just like to throw it back to anybody, please show me from actual combat some capability that the Americans showed in the Battle of Normandy, where they showed prowess from the very beginning that they didn't before. Okay, and show me multiple examples of that, and then I will modify my position. But even with historians that maintain that position, you read their works and all they talk about is, well, Americans messed up with this and they messed up with that, but they learned very quickly. Okay, yeah, that's fine. I believe that. They did learn very quickly. I just don't see any great capabilities. Again, if you have some examples, I'm all ears. Oh, and Mulberry, I forgot about Mulberry. Mulberry is kind of a big con job, in my opinion. It handled 12% of the total tonnage of offloaded stores from the Anglo-American combined logistical effort. Didn't obviously handle anything for the first couple of weeks, and obviously that didn't stop them. I know I think it was Admiral Hall, the American admiral, thought it was a big, bad idea. It was a terrible idea. He said, if anybody, had noticed how the ocean would act upon these type of things, it's obvious they're going to break up and make a mess on the beach. And that's exactly what happened in the American sector. Well, he said, well, that's just an American. But no, Admiral Ramsay, the British Admiral Ramsay, was not a fan of Mulberry as well. So I don't really think Mulberry is anywhere near. If you have Cherbourg, you don't need Mulberry.
Okay, I think Greg has a question now.
Well, yeah, just a comment, just to give you a sort of British aspect on this, really. So I don't wonder if we're asking the wrong question here. Can we all agree that we should have been able to invade France in 1942, whether we think it would have failed or whether it would have succeeded? And I think that's the more interesting question. If we couldn't succeed in 1942, why? And I think the British have to take a large part of the responsibility for that. We didn't have a clue how to go about this because we'd never planned for that sort of war. And just one other thing, while somebody mentioned that you can never change Churchill's mind, Churchill was changing his mind at the end of 1941. He was listening to the arguments. He knew the bomber offensive was failing, and he knew it was time to switch from the bomber offensive, win the war by bombing, to a land offensive, win the war by conventional warfare. One of the reasons why he didn't go for it, well, Portal frightened the living daylights out of him by telling him what it would mean, what it would involve. So I think if the British had been thinking about this before 1941, during 1941, and then the Americans had joined the war and had bolted their resources onto an existing plan, it was very feasible. But I think if you think about it, we went on the defensive in 1940 and we held the Germans in the Battle of Britain. 4 years to switch from the defensive to the offensive is a ridiculously long period of time. Now, we might have failed in 1942, but I think the interesting question is why? And I would suggest that it was because of the approach to war by the British and to a lesser extent by the Americans. The Americans, the great conflict in the 20th century was, do you win wars by bombing or do you win wars by conventional warfare? America had the resources to actually go down both paths. Britain was, we had to choose and we chose the wrong one. But if we'd been if we'd set it up for the Americans in 1942, it was a very feasible operation. It should have been 1942. And if it wasn't, we need to think about why.
Good point.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment. And I remember, I think Vince said in his article about a possible 1943 invasion, it's a matter of priorities, and that wasn't a British priority. They actually had many of the ingredients already. They had the LCA, they invented the LCT. They had been developing amphibious techniques with the combined operations headquarters and everything. So they had, developing doctrine, and we'll talk about that more next week. And it's just they didn't have the will or the wisdom, whatever you want to say. They didn't make the choice that that's what they're going to do. They always would fall back on the bomber thing, whether for whatever reason. But if they made the choice, let's say in December, let's say at Arcadia, it's like, oh, hey, they're asking for a second front. Yeah, we couldn't have done it before, but let's both go all out, and we'll build as many landing craft as we can, and you guys do, and we'll concentrate on that, et cetera, et cetera. They probably could have launched it during the summer. Roosevelt did not move landing craft to number one. Well, he didn't actually ever go to number one, but it went to number two priority in early April of 1942, after the Marshall Memorandum came out, which is another story, part of the backstory. So that indicates maybe at that point in time, he really was thinking about it. But imagine they'd gotten together in January, or imagine even in previous July or August, the British government's like, well, let's build up our amphibious capability in case we need to use this. They had the industrial capacity, they had the technical means, they had the equipment already developed. They just had to produce more of it. And so, yeah, I amen. Greg.
Okay. So, David, unmute and tell us from Canada.
Hey guys. Yeah, hi everybody. I'm sitting here and I find this fascinating because as a Canadian, I find myself in a very interesting position to translate from Queen's English to American English, in the sense that we have, you see the mindsets that were prevalent in 1942, which is fascinating because the discussion has come up, and I did mention it, about the concept of attrition. And for most of the American voices here, it doesn't mean much compared to, for instance, what the British and Canadian experience was with attrition in World War I, particularly the British. Probably one of the dirtiest words in Queen's English would be attrition after the Western Front. And there is openly hostile resistance to this operation, specifically because of the ghosts of Passchendaele, the ghosts of the Somme. And that is one thing that I think the British tried to get across, perhaps poorly, to the Americans in this period. Is like, look, you don't understand. We cannot get engaged in something like this because we do have those ghosts. And you'll notice this later on, in particular with Montgomery. Montgomery, if you read what he writes, he's talking about attrition because they go ahead and they engage in attrition, whether it be in Italy, whether it be in Normandy. But you'll notice the euphemistic language that he employs. Hit them for six, knock them about, etc. Never do they admit or use the term attrition because it has such an incredible negative connotation. It would be sort of similarly saying to Americans, there's something very Vietnam about this. If you know what I mean, it has that negative connotation. But to get back to what we were talking about, yes, Churchill could be persuaded to go, and certainly by August 42, he had said that if push comes to shove, this will be, and he will agree to do this as a response to the Soviet cri de coeur. But it has to be only on two, in his mind at this point, for two reasons. One, significant collapse of the Germans or a significant collapse of the Soviets, and nothing in between. So, you know, and I guess obviously for our counterfactual coming up, we're going to have some fun and we're going to suspend reality on that one for a little bit. Obviously, we're going to have to, you know, put that aside and then take a look at this from an operational perspective. But also remember, this is not an sound operation of war, let alone an operation of war. This is a political operation. And everybody on board knows that at that time. So the idea is, if we're going to put, you know, a square peg into a round hole, how efficient are we going to be in doing it? And that's essentially what we're getting at. And I think that's sort of the crux, the center of gravity of Gary's argument, is that, you know, and I love this argument, by the way. I think it's great. I think it's challenging and it's fun. But you've taken on jamming a square peg into a round hole, just like they were doing at that time. And that's going to be very, very difficult and very challenging. And I think this is part of the fun of it all, to see, you know, whether it really is. But that, you know, what I'm saying is coming straight from the documents in 1942, the chiefs of staff. This is viewed as a political operation, and now they're going to try to make the best out of it. Nobody has agreed that this is a sound operation of war. So that is something that we have to consider as we go up. Also, too, just to get back, there was a couple of comments I put in earlier. First of all, there's no reason to suspect we wouldn't have Ultra at this time humming along like it has been so far, and it's developing on a regular basis. It's doing wonders when it comes to developing the Orbat and keeping a finger on the pulse. As a matter of fact, and I've said this before, if you are going to entertain the concept of attrition, you need to have something like Ultra to keep the finger on the pulse of what your enemy is bringing out from the cupboard and putting on the shelf. If you don't have the kind of intelligence, then you get Passchendaele in the Somme. In other words, one attack after another, hoping to grind your opponent down, but having no clue when this is going to end. All right, so that's something that would certainly work, and particularly for Gary's argument, that if you're going to engage in attrition, you have perhaps one of the best aces up your sleeve at the moment, which is that. And just to get back, somebody had asked about the intelligence. All of the intelligence for the beaches at this time and any kind of landing was done by the Inter Services Topographical Department, which was part of British Naval Intelligence. And that was created in 1940, I guess it was 1940, by John Godfrey, the DNI. And it was a response to the failure, believe it or not, 20 years of arguing over Gallipoli. In other words, we had plenty of intelligence to get to Gallipoli, but we had no clue what was on land when we landed. So as a result, that was a mistake they didn't want to make. And they would have brought that in as much as they humanly could have for this particular operation. Mind you, it had only really got started in late 41. So it's still, like everything else, it's developing. But they actually did a pretty good job at Dieppe, believe it or not, despite what we hear. And that's one thing. And oh, by the way, Gary, I got to give you credit. Thank you for, you know, mentioning the architectural differences between Dieppe and this operation. I applaud you. Thank you. Because this is something that we tend to forget. Yeah. We link them together, and that's not the case. Okay, so that's my long-winded set of comments. I'm sitting here and I've been chomping at the bit for the last 45 minutes. So there you go.
Okay, so let me just respond. And I understand what you're saying, and it's spot on in terms of the mood and the sort of emotional intellect/emotional response. But my counter argument is it's twofold. One is, they didn't avoid the attrition of Tunisia, of Sicily, of Italy, of Normandy. Normandy, you know, we think, oh yeah, it was bad at Omaha Beach and it was kind of bad, and then oh yeah, next thing you know, we're breaking out and ready. No, but in the weeks in between, most of this audience is going to know, but a lot of other people kind of forget, it was basically a bloodbath. Okay, there was a lot of casualties in Normandy. Okay, in those 2 months before they broke out. So they didn't avoid that. They were trying to avoid it, but in the end, they're forced into doing it. But in the meantime, I think there was 90,000 casualties, British casualties in Italy. I don't know, between Sicily and, it's over 100,000, or maybe it's even that many killed. I don't know. It's quite a few. Anyway, they didn't avoid that.
Okay.
So yeah. So
I just
and the
quickly
other
jump
thing,
in?
well, hold on.
Okay.
The other thing I'm talking about an attritional battle, but it's a different kind of attritional battle than you would have seen on the Western Front or even in Normandy, because in those, they were not defensive operations. Those were typically offensive. So I'm going to expose myself, and then I'm going to create a situation. No, they're going to seize this poorly defended peninsula, which I don't really have much doubt that they could have done. And you never know because it's counterfactual. But if you look at the resources there, and then they're just going to hang on for dear life. And now you're in a really favorable defensive terrain. And you don't really have to, if you lose a half a mile or a mile or so, it's not that big of a deal. And you're just going to pour on firepower. You've got your organic artillery, which is already pretty great in both armies. And then you got the naval gunfire. So it's the other side that's going to be taking much higher percent. I'm not saying that the casualties necessarily be light, quote unquote. I'm not saying that, but it's not. It's probably going to be much more. It's at least set up operationally to be much more costly for the Germans. And at some point it probably would come to what happened in 1944, which is Hitler says, okay, we're going to stop attacking, because we see that's not working. So they're going to do that. I say that, but actually you want them to do that as long as possible to exhaust themselves, and then you come back. By that time it's like, oh, wow, Sixth Army's been surrounded, and maybe we should go on the offensive now. But by that time, the other side has worn themselves down. It's a different fight. Okay.
Okay, can I jump in?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, thanks. Yeah, and I understand your point. The only problem is, how do you sell this to the public? In other words, look at what we've gone through with the pandemic and just things like masks and pandemic weariness. All right, this is going to be an extremely, if not completely impossible sell to the British. And for the Americans, I think you can sell it to them quickly, but I just don't think it's going to last, because I think Passchendaele and the Somme are going to come home to roost for the Americans very quickly.
But there's mass demonstrations in Britain in favor of opening a second front. They obviously don't think it's going to be costly.
Hang on. Look, you and I are going to we're going to agree to disagree. You and I are going to disagree. Those demonstrations are orchestrated. They're also blown out of proportion. But more importantly, they are not being adhered to by Churchill. Churchill, you can see that in his responses. In other words, yes, I know they're squawking, but the adults are talking. You know what I mean? That's his attitude. And it's not as, and you could try spinning it that way. But at the end of the day, and the big difference with what you were mentioning before, is that attrition is a means to an end when you're liberating countries and you're moving forward, and you can sell that. Here, this is attrition for the sake of attrition. In other words, we're not going to break out. You're not going to have, hey, we've liberated Caen, we've liberated Falaise, we've liberated Brussels, and etc. out of this. You're stuck. You're a cork in a frickin' bottle, right?
They were stuck in Italy too. Nobody worried about that.
Yeah, but they were.
Why is that?
Had the promise. Look, there's the promise.
And I just have to say that I do disagree, because I think the whole idea of just opening a second, if you look at even opinion polls and stuff, both sides in Britain and in the United States, there was favorability. There was a majority of people, or a plurality, that wanted to go forward with offensive action against the Germans in that year. So they're not going to sell it as an attritional campaign. I don't even think they're thinking about it in that respect. I'm telling you that they're not. They're thinking of it as about, it's really about air bases. I think it was Tedder that came up with the whole idea that World War II is a battle of airfields, to gain airfields. That's pretty much what it is. They want to gain this spot, and they want to have a big air battle with the German Air Force. Okay.
For attrition purposes.
For attrition purposes, but I mean, not the same as, you know.
Yeah, but I
passion.
mean, Gary, I think where you and I are going to disagree is when it comes to Italy, you have the promise of liberating Rome and Naples and things like that
Yeah,
coming
well, and
out.
eventually you will.
There is no
and that's the
end
thing. When
game
you
here.
do liberate
That's
the
the
rest of
problem.
France at some point, whether it's in 2 months or 6 months or a little
Yeah.
bit longer, which I can't imagine would be much longer than that, then the whole psychology collapses in your mind, and people don't remember that part. They just and I'm just telling you that's what. Think about the whole Italian campaign in that way. At the time, I'm sure there are a lot of people, especially if you're fighting there, but even I'm sure in the press, if you go back and look, people are frustrated, this and that. But we barely think about it anymore because Rome was eventually liberated, right?
Mhm.
But it took between September of 43 till June of 44. That's a long time. You
Yeah.
know, I don't
but,
really
but
think
the thing is,
I
you
don't think
are
what's
pushing
going
up.
on the Eastern Front
Yeah.
that's the main thing. We're going to talk about that more next
Yeah.
week. I just don't see the Germans they're stressed to the max at that time.
Yeah, but in
So-
Italy, you are pushing forward. That's the idea. Even if it's
But there
small,
wasn't any pushing
you're
forward for
going
6
yard
months.
by
They're
yard,
stuck
but
on the
you're
winter
going-
line.
Yeah, but remember that Sledgehammer isn't like that. There is no logistical tail for breakout here. You are stuck. It's the cork in the bottle. You're not moving
Capture
forward.
Cherbourg and you turn it into a logistical tail.
Okay, but then you're also limited by size and space,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah, we'll
so
talk
that-
about
that's
that more.
that's
next
where
week.
our argument will be.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
Okay, I think we should get.
All right. Well, I think
Good one.
Frank.
I think there was some support in Britain for taking some action in 1942. The other thing is that never believe that Churchill had fixed ideas. He was changing his mind all the time. So you can, one moment he was in favor of the bomber offensive. The next moment he was in favor of invasion. But
Okay. Well, Gary, how long do you
I'll
want
stay
to
as long.
stick around?
I'm a bitter
good.
ender, man. I'm always the last.
Oh,
one.
okay. Wow. Well, I think probably another going beyond 4 is probably a little ridiculous, right? But and I know, well, Frank, I'm sure has been
Let's let
waiting
someone
for a
talk about
while.
it.
So let's go to
Here
Frank,
he's
and
gonna
then
let me
yeah,
have it with 2 barrels, but
yeah. Frank will hit you hard.
we usually have
Yeah,
something.
hi. Basically, no. Let's look at it. What won't happen? What won't happen is the taking of 350,000 Italians and Germans in Tunisia, because you don't have Operation Torch. You don't have it. You don't get 500 tanks to assist Alkenwick because of the loss of Tobruk, with 35,000 South Africans mostly. You don't get that because the debate would have to have been decided as to whether to go on this or not. If they're going on it, you don't get the Shermans for El Alamein. You just don't get them because they have to go to this operation, which is apparently going to take place. So that's going to jeopardize any kind of El Alamein, a second El Alamein, right? So
That's
what you
Totally incorrect.
what you also don't get, what you don't get, first of all, the Brits have lost 80,000 in Singapore. They've lost 35,000 there. They've also lost 2 Australian divisions because they have to send them over to fight the Japanese, right? So they've lost nearly, 150, 160,000 troops, but this is before. That's why Allenbrook is not even countenancing this thing, this whole idea of Sledgehammer. But okay, what about the French? The French fought very bloody hard, unfortunately for us. They should have fought the Germans as hard as they fought us in Operation Torch. But what about their navy? Their navy is huge. Now it's assumed, they're going to sink their own stuff like they did. Why would they? If this is an invasion of France, and by the way, Laval and others would have possibly gone whichever way Hitler wanted them to go. By the way, at this time, so you got a huge navy. And by the way, what happened to the Tirpitz, the Scharnhorst and the Prince Eugen? They did with Gunay's now. It's true, not out of commission, but they did a channel run. Why can't they do it the other way?
Right.
And the timing of this, if it's going to be timed to impact on Operation Uranus and Saturn, it has to be done precisely. It has to work, by the way. It has to absolutely work for Hitler to divert forces from in front of Stalin. And that is not necessarily going to take place if it's in late October. If it goes into November, like Operation Torch, forget about it. There's no reason to do anything. as far as diversion goes. And to say that the 6th Panzer is going to definitely be held in place, not sure about that. Not sure about that at all. And you're saying that this is going to be an attrition on the base of the continent peninsula? Well, guess what doesn't happen in 43? You can dismiss the Italians all you like, okay, but they put 9 million men in uniform in World War II. And if they're going to fight beyond 43, you got a problem. Even if they, the Folgore division was pretty damn good, and so was their San Marco division. And it's quite possible that their other divisions would have got very good. And to say, oh, they would have just fallen out the way because there's what? What would have been going on? There's no fillets. There's no, you do not get bombers contributing to Goodwood or Totalize because they can't do it. They would, the Americans screwed that up in 44 the first time round. So to say that would be synchronized with our landing is problematic and just would not be able to do it. And that was significant.
Can I respond?
Okay, yeah.
Saying
a lot of questions, Frank. Yeah.
First of all, the tanks for the Sherman tanks were already dispatched at the end of June, beginning of July. So it's before the July meetings. They're already underway. They're going to get there. Plus, maybe you didn't see that part, but there's plenty of Sherman tanks. There's plenty of the one thing that Americans don't lack is tanks. They got tanks coming out of every orifice. All right, and
it's
same with the British.
Going.
The crime.
Where is it going?
Huh? It's not going anywhere. That's the crime. It's not doing anything. It's sitting in depots, all of them. That's the problem. So
you are not going to secure 350,000 anybody if you don't do Operation
Tunisgrad.
Torch.
Okay, let's talk about Tunisgrad. Okay, really, what you're talking about is let's just look at a different strategy. Okay, there's two possibilities. Or three possibilities. Either the British decide, hey, we're not even going to do a counterattack at El Alamein. I doubt that happens, but let's just say they don't. Or let's say they go ahead and it's pretty much the same which why wouldn't it be? If anything, they should be weaker. And they drive all the way to Tripoli, and they can't go into Tunisia, so they wrap up the campaign even earlier. Well, that's good. Or let's just say that what Vincent said. He goes, if they don't do Torch, probably it's the same sort of seesaw thing. Whatever. The Germans and the Italians are still engaged, and they're engaged. They're not additive to anything that can happen on the continent. All you're looking at is the increment of maybe 4 divisions. The 10th Panzer, which I admit that's a really good division. There's 10 Panzer, but then you have the Hermann Göring, but that wasn't even completely wiped out. They somehow hadn't sent them all over or something because they're showing up on Sicily and in Italy. Then you have the 999th Division. All right, have you heard about the 999th Division in any of the combat narratives? Maybe you have. I haven't. They're basically made up of all penal convicts that given a second chance, German convicts. Okay, I guess we couldn't take them off the board. And then there's one of those 300 series divisions. That's it. That's the increment. So you're telling me those other ones, yeah, they're not lost. In essence, it's almost better because now you have the responsibility as Italy, as Germany, to supply these guys and keep them going in a campaign which is now a complete sideshow. Okay, so I don't think the increment of 3.5 to 4.5 divisions, of which there's only one really good division in there, really tips the balance one way or the other. So, and you made some other points, but those are the only two I can remember to respond to. But yeah, if the whole idea that the British aren't going to be convinced, I think it would be very difficult. And like I said, if that's the end of discussion, then it's end of discussion. But I just feel like it's a worthwhile topic anyway, because there are so many other myths that are sort of supported or maybe even brought into the whole discussion based upon the impossibility of an earlier second front. Okay. And so even if it's just to understand really what was happening and how the resources were and the capabilities, like I said, on both sides are, and in the end we say, hey, it's never going to happen anyway. So, all right, fine. It's never going to happen, but at least we got this, at least some of the story more correct than we did before it. Anyway, so that's my position.
Okay, let's go to Vincent again. You got to unmute, Vincent.
I'm unmuted. I have several comments. First of all, Tunis grad, maybe 235,000 Italian, German, and Arab auxiliary troops, plus civilian bureaucrats and everything, maybe 160,000 combat troops. Better to have them supplied and fighting like Gary put. Rick Atkinson and Kasserine Pass. I covered a lot of the same ground that Rick covered in Operation Torch. And one thing Rick does very well is he's got an eye for a good story, and he's got an eye for a good anecdote. And a lot of the points that he made in Torch were perhaps a little bit exaggerated, like landing craft, landing on the beaches and overturning and all the troops being wiped out. And you look at the number of casualties that were incurred in the actual coming ashore, and there was, I think, 2 people dead, something like that. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was very slight. And a lot of these stories are based upon journalistic accounts that were made at the time, filed at the time, more for effect than to reflect reality. Did you talk about the impact on the French state, if in the part that I missed, Gary?
No, I didn't. I'm really eager to talk about that, but
Well,
kind of ran out of time. But next week I definitely want to talk about that, because
it's an important thing, because that that Darlan was plotting to join the Allies as early as that summer, and he had plans to bring Pétain over to Algiers to join the Allied cause. The French fleet would have sailed, and they would have sailed in support of the Allies if there had been a landing in October. I firmly believe it's counterfactual, but the plans existed to do that. At the very least, the Germans and the Italians, felt necessary to invade the free zone of France in November of 1942 in response to an Allied landing in Africa. If the Allied landing in Normandy had happened in October of 1942, you damn well believe that the Germans would not have trusted the French to stand by their side or to resist this invasion, because Lavelle notwithstanding, and even Lavelle, when he was offered the opportunity to join the Axis as a full ally in November, was it 12th or 10th?
Yeah, 10th.
November 10th of 1942, he refused. He basically said, well, let me think about it. And Hitler, wasn't going to listen to that. So even saying that Lavelle would have joined the Germans is nonsense, because when he had the chance, he didn't do it. So obviously, we have to subtract the German and Italian divisions that would have been required to occupy the free part of France. I mean, these are all impacts that would have followed from a landing in Normandy in 1942. And they're major impacts. I mean, how many divisions were involved in? Yeah, so sure, the Vichy, or the French state has 8 divisions, okay? Well, still 8 divisions is 8 divisions. There's a lot of stuff here that I think supports your point of view. The idea that Italy would have struggled on to the bitter end. Well, Italy was looking for a way out of the war. The fascist Grand Council removed Mussolini. It wasn't the Allies that removed Mussolini. That was his downfall. So there's a lot of factors here that haven't even been brought up. So that's just my comments.
Yeah, I actually called the French, colloquially called the Vichy French, and the Italians as the soft political underbelly of the Axis. Okay, it wasn't from an operational standpoint, because the geography obviously didn't turn out to be the soft underbelly. But yeah, there's already in December of 42, there are people influential people in in Italy, and probably before that, like looking to get out of the war. And you have to take into consideration a bigger impact, a much bigger loss for them was the loss of the 8th Army in Russia in the middle of December. Okay, that's a big thing. So yeah, I do feel like, you know, there never was this huge consensus within Italy for this war to begin with. That's my opinion. I'm not based on a lot of research, but maybe, you know, I'm sure Vince could correct me on that if I'm wrong. But you know, there's always it doesn't have the level of popularity. And yeah, the absolute imperative for any of these guys is, you know, when the war is over, we want to be on the winning side. Okay, so even if it's what looks like in our eyes this not successful operation because they're hemmed into this small peninsula, and but the handwriting's on the wall that's telling them it's a statement. Hey, we're coming. Okay, and then you combine that with what's happening on the Eastern Front. It's like, yeah, I guess the Germans are going to lose. I don't want to be on the wrong side. Right?
That's another point, Gary, and it was never going to be presented as a, you know, the Normandy prisoner of war camp. It was a bridgehead, and it was going to lead to further things, a landing in Pas-de-Calais or a landing along the Atlantic coast or somewhere. But nobody was going to perceive it as just the dead end.
Yeah, yeah. For Marshall, it was really phase one. It became phase one of Roundup. Okay?
Yes, yes, yes.
And now you got the air bases and et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think Roundup would ever happen because I think they would have broken out well before that. But that's how it's going to be sold to people. This is phase one of what's going to. Hey, it's all we can do this year, but guess what's going to happen next year? And that's, I feel like, how it's going to hit the population of most of Europe as well, including France. Okay. And so
the French would have been electrified. French would have been electrified.
Absolutely. And it's so much different when you invade their colony, you invade North Africa, it's a different thing, especially for the political general, you know, all these generals, they understand politics and they don't really want the Americans and the British to be in their colony because it's, first of all, it's bad. It makes them look bad with the local population. Plus, secondly, there's always the suspicion, well, what are the British up to? Are they going to try to horn in on our territory? Well, if you invade France, it's obviously that the Anglo-Americans aren't going to try to take over France. They're there for one reason and one reason only, and that's to eventually liberate the country and defeat defeat the Germans, which would be their common enemy. That was their common enemy at the beginning of the war and in the previous war. So I just think politically it's completely different.
Well, taking people like Lavelle, for example, you know, the archetypical German sympathizer. Well, Lavelle's politics were not, well, by that time they were not all that different than Hitler's. Perhaps maybe he believed in a Europe defended against the Bolshevik threat, and he saw Hitler as being the best vehicle to obtain that. But he didn't like the Germans. Pétain didn't like the Germans. Darlan didn't like the Germans. They all hated the Germans. They were all Frenchmen, and they supported the French state. And we obviously, Pétain and Lavelle had visions for France that are kind of very distasteful, but that doesn't change the fact that they were not pro-German. They were not pro-German. You know, the King of Italy hated the Germans. The Germans were not really very popular amongst their Axis allies.
Right. So, and you know, the other thing is, and this is looking at a little bit different level, but again, being the soft underbelly, it's like, you know, look at the fiasco in the Aegean Islands. Okay, when Churchill tried to do what he did, but then fast forward to whenever it was that the Germans, when was it the Germans abandoned Greece, Vince?
They abandoned it in the summer of '44. They started pulling out.
Yeah.
Okay, was it the summer of '44?
Yeah,
summer
yeah.
44. Yeah.
Started withdrawing April, Gary.
Okay, yeah. Okay, good. So, all right. So you defeat their army in elsewhere, and then you just walk in.
Yeah.
What's wrong with that? The British would love that.
All
So
right.
that's the difference.
We're running out of time here, so actually I'm going to ask Brandon and Jim to stick to one question. Maybe Brandon and Jim can both each ask their questions, so we can give Gary time to get to them. So go Brandon and then Jim. Yeah.
I'll just cede my time to someone who has, like, whoever. I'll just cede my time.
Okay, so I think we had Jim and then Frank.
Well, you
Jim?
don't have to do that, Brandon. I just wanted, this is why it's so fascinating to have this discussion. And as Gary knows, we emailed Robert Paxton, and he is 90 years old, and he got really excited by this idea and wanted to talk about it. So I have to follow up with Robert to see if he's going to carry through, because he emailed me twice and said, yes, I want to talk about it. His argument is the Vichy French would have defended and fought with the Germans. So that would be interesting to have that argument put forth. Now, the Italians is another interesting question. And who to get to do that? Like maybe John Gooch, maybe McGregor Knox, maybe Brian Sullivan. There's all sorts of people who are pretty have good expertise on the Italians in World War II. And that'd be a very interesting question to throw in the mix here. So that's only a comment I made. I mean,
Couldn't we get Al Nofi on that too? I mean,
Al would be interesting to talk about it. But I think John and Brian and McGregor are, they've gone in the records in Italy for years and written all those books about it. And I know McGregor, I know John, and certainly Brian, but we could ask them to see if they'd be willing to come and talk about this, because I think it'd be very interesting to fill out this dimension of what we're talking about. But thanks to Gary. I knew, of course I knew it would get everybody stirred up. All right. Well, thank you so much, Gary. It's always a pleasure to hear your thoughts. And I know we're going to have a lot of fun next week. That'll be even more action-packed.
Yeah, it'll even be more counterfactual. So we're really going to have a knockdown, drag out about talking about things that never happened. and probably never would have. But
it's interesting. Everybody do their homework. That's interesting. The Tirpitz, the Prince Eugen, and the Scharnhorst. I hadn't thought of that one. That's a good one, Frank. All right, well, listen.
Got a question real quick, guys. Gary, do you have the stuff on Operation Wet Bob? Do you have, because essentially
I have
that's
Wet Bob.
what it is.
Wet Bob is Wet Bob is just the name they gave to Sledgehammer after they turned Sledgehammer into a deception operation.
Okay.
Literally, you can see on the documents they've crossed out Sledgehammer.
They put in Wet Bob. But I'm just saying, do we have it? Because I have it, and I can upload it to a Dropbox if everybody wants to see it, because it shows the scale of buildup, et cetera, and whatever else. So at least we're all on the same page when it comes to
very good
counterfactual.
Yeah, I have a bunch of different versions of Wet Bobs, because they even did little revisions even after they canceled it. They did a few more revisions before they shelved it. So
David, that's a great idea.
Cool. Yeah, do that.
That's a great idea, man.
I'll pop it up. I'll do that. I'll send a link to that way, so we're not arguing over the minutiae.
Exactly. And then that was the reason why we passed along Joe's dissertation, so everybody could read that. And then Greg, it's great to have you here. I guess you're calling from jolly old England, right? Yeah. Okay. So it's great to have you here. And we can't hear you though.
Just unmute yourself.
Yeah. All right. Anyway, it's great to have you here. I see you've done a lot of books on the RAF, and it'd be great to hear you talk about that perspective too, because we haven't really gotten into that yet. Let's someone who knows about the air power issue to talk about that in detail. And Vincent, of course, it's always great to see you and all the other folks here. But let's say sayonara for now, and we'll continue this fight and argument next week. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Ciao, ciao.
Until round two.
Round two. Right. Exactly. Round two.